The race for the One Piece is officially on. In this chapter, Eiichiro Oda lays out every major character and faction that are going to be integral to the final saga and the eventual crowning of the new Pirate King. This is a landmark chapter in One Piece history, and it's about race in more ways than one. Because while Vegapunk doesn't heavily enlighten us on stuff that we don't know in this chapter, he does touch on an interesting thing, being the extinction and persecution of certain races throughout history. And while he's talking about this on this single page, we see Bartholomew Kuma, Charlotte Pudding, and King, all three of whom are the only known living representations of their respective races. The Buccaneers, the Three-Eyed Tribe, and the Lunarians, the latter two of which we've never even seen any other members of even in a flashback, and all of whom are currently facing extinction, because Kuma will be dead very shortly if not already, while Charlotte Pudding is in prison and King looks like he may also be in prison, or at least a very dark place. It's hard to tell, but prison is what I'd assumed. We haven't seen King since he was defeated by Green Bull on Wano, so my assumption was that he would have been taken to Impel Down, because where else could you possibly hold someone with a bounty of over 1 billion berries? But that was a very bad assumption to make on my part. Firstly, because he's still all bandaged up, and if he went to Impel Down, they would have given him the funky prisoner uniform. So this might indicate that Green Bull actually failed in capturing King and Queen, mostly because he pissed his plants after feeling the sheer girthsome haki of Shanks. And looking back on it, Green Bull requested a marine ship to make its way into Wano, assumedly to take custody of King and Queen, which almost certainly never happened. So I guess King is just out there somewhere in the world. I'd say he flew away from Wano, but Zoro sliced one of his wings off. Either way, it's unclear whether or not King is actually hearing Vegapunk's message, but regardless, King has to be joining us for the final war, right? King's whole thing is that he was waiting for the Joy Boy, and initially he served Kaido ever so loyally because he thought that Kaido may have been Joy Boy. So King is a very natural ally, and unless there are any other non-Seraphim Lunarians out there, an integral figure in the climax of this story. And of course, I'd say the same thing about Charlotte Pudding, because the Three-Eyed Tribe are now softly implied by Oda as having been allies of the Ancient Kingdom, hence why they've become so rare, because they were probably the target of an extermination like the Buccaneers and the Lunarians, for their assorted crimes against the world government. And something I find really cool is how Oda has had this in mind for at least all of post-time skip One Piece, and he made sure that both Wano and Whole Cake Island included a member of these near-extinct races that would go on to play major roles down the line. In fact, Pudding was introduced at the end of Fishman Island, so this is insanely good planning. And it's very satisfying to see both Whole Cake Island and Wano still continuing to pay us narrative dividends after such a large investment on our part. To the Buccaneers though, a small thing I really liked here are the dual panels of Bartholomew Kuma. We see him in the modern day lying on the giant warrior pirate ship, and then the flashback panel has him in more or less the same framing. And this is an invitation for the anime to do something amazing, because the only difference in the panels are the position of Kuma's head. So it's practically begging for a transition where modern day Kuma moves his head down, and by the time it reaches a stop, we're in the past. And as if this one singular page doesn't have enough, we also catch up with Marco on Sphinx Island, also known as the location where Whitebeard was born, and that's why Marco now serves as its caretaker in retirement. And he has a flashback that, rather embarrassingly for him, he's had before, almost exactly the same as well. During Wano, when Marco discovered that King was a Lunarian, he had the same flashback of Whitebeard talking about the land of gods that was supposedly on top of the Red Line. So look, Oda's pulling a bit of a Toei here by reusing flashbacks. I do feel like Oda could have put maybe a little bit more information in here, but it's always nice to see Marco. And I wonder if this is gonna bring him out of retirement for one last job again. And while we're on this section, I think it's also worth lingering on the Skypiea check-in, because up until this point, Oda has been avoiding Skypiea in our world tour, which makes sense because they don't have any way of actually listening to this message. At the moment, they're even more isolated than Wano. And in this panel, we see Wiper, and if you're not up to date on his cover story movements, he and the other major warrior leaders of Shandia now serve as God's guardians, God being Gon 4. We also see Konus, who is carrying what appears to be a basket of what I believe are pumpkin noodles, because during the time skip, she started a pumpkin cafe with Rocky, as they became best friends after Enel's death game. And finally, we see Isa, who looks like she's just finished a shift at Wagomuland, a theme park they built inspired by Usopp and the rubber band technology he introduced to the Sky People. And Isa works there as a balloon vendor, which is a much more exciting job than it sounds, because balloons are made out of the fabled rubber substance and are thus very, very exciting. Balloons on Skypiea are a pretty big deal. But all of that lovely, peaceful life aside, they've really had it good for the past 2 years. This panel is very important, because this is the chapter that shows us every faction that is going to be key to the final saga. And the Sky People are certainly no exception to that, especially Shandia, because their tribe was directly entrusted with protecting one of the poneglyphs, just like Alabasta and Fishman Island. Which, speaking of, we we also see panels of Vivi and Shirahoshi right above the panel of Skypiea. And again, this is almost absurdly purposeful, because this is the part where Vegapunk is talking about the scary ancient weapons. So we see Shirahoshi, who is Poseidon, then Vivi, whose country was torn apart by a dude just looking for Pluton, and Skypiea, because Uranus was probably directly linked back to them during the ancient times. Back to Egghead though, this looks like the conclusion of the tragic tale of Jewelry Bonnie and Bartholomew Kuma, with Bonnie and Luffy teaming up to jump an old man, which usually I wouldn't encourage, but in this case, mate. And speaking of encouraging, Luffy encouraging Bonnie in this chapter is what I would call an Oda father-daughterism, because Oda's writing style did change quite drastically after he had 2 daughters of his own, and that's why you get stuff like the end of Dressrosa, where Luffy appeared out of nowhere and got all up in Rebecca's personal business by asking her if she was okay with the situation with her father, and then carried her to Kuros and gave them that happy ending. Luffy's a good guy, he does good things, some of those good things are helping people, but he usually stays very disconnected from their personal lives. So what he did with Rebecca was sweet but quite uncharacteristic. And that's because Oda tends to use Luffy as divine intervention for whenever a character reminds him, Oda, of his own real life situation. He has a core desire to see happiness in the father-daughter dynamic. And here Oda's doing the same thing with Bonnie. This time from Bonnie's perspective, Luffy is a literal divine intervention, and Oda is using him to give Bonnie and Kuma the best ending available to them under the current circumstances. Although in this case it makes an extra degree of sense because Bonnie's powers can only function if she believes they can. So it's not just your stereotypical believe in yourself young manga protagonist. Believe in yourself and produce your inner power thing. It's not that. And even if it was that, I really don't care, because after Bonnie succeeds, we see this panel of Kuma performing what I believe is a very subtle smile, or at least a not frown. His expression definitely changed from the previous panel we saw him in, which was very sad. There was such a sad curve. And this is everything I wanted, as well as everything Kuma wanted, which was to watch his daughter become free. Now his job here is done, and he can finally move on and hopefully rest in peace. And of course, the conclusion against Saint Saturn was very satisfying to see as well. Luffy and Bonnie doing their absolute best to liberate Saturn from life, which is very well deserved after Saturn had torturously removed pieces of Kuma. And so now it's pretty fun to see him getting torn to pieces as well. This is the first time I think Saint Saturn can call himself holy and have it actually be true because of all of the holes. And mate, just on the holes, those were some incredibly strong punches. Every single one of them blowing a new piece of Saturn away. It's like a reverse jigsaw puzzle. And I don't know, something about seeing that panel of Saturn with all of his legs and such crumbling, it was morbidly satisfying. It would admittedly be nicer if I didn't know that he could regenerate and that he'll probably be back. Although, there is a chance that Oda might just get rid of him right here and now. Mostly because I've been thinking, and this is not a good thing, but I've been thinking about how much more value Saint Saturn could possibly provide to this story. I'd go so far as to call him the main antagonist of Egghead Island, and I think he served that role to perfection. His story is directly linked to Bonnie and Kuma, and our focus on that is ending here, so I really don't know how much more we gain by keeping Saint Saturn around. At the moment, I consider him sort of like Jack, a brilliant antagonist on Zou, whose natural disaster motif had a beginning, middle, and end, but he survived and was carried over to Wano, and didn't do a whole lot there but take up time and space that could have been given to one of the billions of other characters. So if Saturn survives, I think it would purely be so that he could be used as some other character's final fight, which doesn't excite me too much. Again, I saw what happened with Jack. It was nice that Inuarashi got a moment, but I don't know. What does excite me, however, is that I think I'm seeing Saint Saturn falling into water. So if he is a Devil Fruit user, we are well and truly in drowning territory here. That, or we still have Emmett's final thing it is that he plans on using, and if that is some sort of weapon, then Saturn might now be in a state so injured that even he can't regenerate in time to survive whatever Emmett is about to do. And to bring up the Egghead incident again, look, this has been touted as historic. And yes, we have Vegapunk's message, and that's pretty cool, but something that would really be a turning point for this world would be the death of an Elder Star. Now, I can't be bothered to go through and count, but I think this is a solid contender for One Piece chapter featuring the most named characters. There's probably some Marineford chapters that beat it, but this is still wild. They're not just any old named characters either. These are real important people, many of which we're not even going to go through because we'll be here all day. Like Kizaru, for example, he's here still lying down and having a well-earned rest after murdering a friend for the sake of something justice. I think the only reason we see him is because he's tied to Bonnie's story, and again, this is where we're closing that. Same thing with Sentomaru. We get quick flashes of them to conclude the whole Bonnie arc, and it is admittedly nice to see the shame smeared across Kizaru's face because he's listening to what Bonnie's saying about all of the stuff with her mom and her dad, and Kizaru knows that he has been actively helpful in ruining this 12-year-old girl's life. I did the thing. I said I wasn't going to talk about Kizaru and then I just couldn't shut up. But I don't know, that's Oda. These small panels, they're not just haphazard reaction shots. There's a lot of meaning behind each and every one of them, and it's really difficult not to read into them. But I'm going to resist because I have to address the last few pages of this chapter, which gave me genuine chills. Because it was like watching athletes line up in their lanes and hearing the starting gun go off for the race. Except that there's a few more competitors than I initially thought. Before getting into that, I do want to address what a landmark moment this is though, because this might go over some people's heads, but One Piece began with Roger speaking to the world and igniting the Great Age of Piracy. Then the halfway point of the series, the pre-time skip era, ended with Whitebeard speaking to the world, reigniting that flame and kicking the race into its next phase. And now that we're in the final saga, Vegapunk is speaking to the world and making that race tangible once more. This is the last time this is going to happen, because we're not talking about some sort of theoretical legendary treasure anymore. One of the 12 people on this final page is going to find the One Piece. And I've never really considered this seriously, but here I believe Oda is presenting the idea that the Marines are going to make a serious effort to find the One Piece after hearing Vegapunk's message. That they are going to launch a full-scale attempt to join this already insanely huge conflict in order to prevent it from falling into the hands of one of the 4 emperors. And it's a pretty logical step. I'm honestly surprised that they haven't launched an effort before now, because that would be a great way to get rid of the Great Age of Piracy, to have the Marines conquer Laugh Tale and take custody of the One Piece. But from the perspective of the average Marine, it's about protecting peace. If Vegapunk is correct and the future of this planet depends entirely on who finds the One Piece and what they decide to do, then you'd probably want that future in your hands rather than one of them nasty pirates or the Revolutionary Army, who are also prominently featured in the amazing final 2-page spread of the 12 people most essential to the series going forward. Oda didn't draw these guys by accident. They are the representatives of every major faction that is going to be involved in this one last struggle for the world. And I have to say, what a cast. If you'd asked me to construct a list of the most important figures going forward, then there's a few people I'm not sure I would have included here. Kobe, for example, feels very out of place initially because he is surrounded on all sides by the true legends of the One Piece world. Here, he's being flanked by Emo on one side and Figurland Garling on the other. Our Kobe is definitely the underdog in this lineup. I love that he's here though, because Kobe is the representative of the future of the Marines. And the reason why Oda has placed him here is to serve as an ideological counter to Fleet Admiral Sakazuki, and perhaps even Kuzan, who left the Marines, no longer seeing it as a viable path to justice. Look, by the end of the series, one of the characters on this page will be the Pirate King, and another one of the characters will be Fleet Admiral, and I think that the latter will be Kobe. Realistically, he will outlast almost every character on these pages. And honestly, I don't know if this is going to be a controversial thing to say, but I don't see it as entirely outrageous to suggest that Kobe is the person who is going to end up with the One Piece, and thus be the one to make the big decision about which direction this world goes in. Of everyone here, I kind of trust him the most. The other surprise to me is Kuzan, because we all knew that he was a pretty big deal being a former admiral and everything, but I didn't expect him to be this close to the heart of the climax, and it's starting to make me even more ridiculously curious about his history. I'm starting to wonder a lot more about every character shown here actually, specifically if any of them also happen to be secret hidden Ds, because these are the 12 chosen candidates of fate, so they all have something deeper going on. Sabo we can rule out because he has the inherited will of Ace, who was a D, and he's also the 3rd character in a row I've mentioned with a curious aesthetic trait. Something I don't think I've ever really noticed is how much Oda relies on the bandage across the nose idea to indicate injuries. On this final page, we see Kobe, Sabo, and Kuzan all recovering from major battles, and all seem to have been injured in that exact same spot across their nose. Although in Kobe's case, it's a band-aid, not a bandage, so it's more like he scratched his nose on a particularly sharp branch or something. I think Oda does it because it's an easy way to indicate injury without obscuring the face too much, and thus making expressions difficult. But also, when we see King earlier, he has a bandage across his nose as well. Anyway, that isn't relevant to anything, I just think it's a fun artistic habit to point out. But it's not all about which characters were included on this page. I'm also surprised by who Oda didn't include in this lineup, like say Monkey D. Garp, who very likely isn't dead, and when he gets unfrozen, he's still going to be a pretty huge force to be reckoned with. But I guess this goes back to the Kobe thing. You'll notice that everyone here is relatively young, and by that I mean 40 and under, and the elderly who are showcased, such as Figurland Garling, Sakazuki, and the oldest boy of all, Emu, all represent the remnants of former generations that need to be overcome to change the world. And I guess that Garp does also fall into that category of times gone by and needing to move past him. As Vegapunk says in this chapter, a new age is heralded by by the passing of old legends. So we do still need a handful of old legends to have that passing. And while we do see Emu, some key figures very much missing from these pages are the Elder Stars themselves, further solidifying that their role has been forever diminished, and who knows, Egghead Island might be the last stop on the One Piece train for all of them. But with this, the final saga is now set up. Egghead Island is the pre-game analysis for our sports metaphor that I can't be bothered to flesh out properly, but we've now gone through all of the players except for one. On the final 2 pages, there is something that I did not expect this late into the game, because we have what looks to be another Oda silhouette of a disgustingly important character who we've still yet to meet. Although what we do know is that he's carrying a sword that looks eerily similar to Shanks' Blade Griffin, and also Figgle and Garling's as of yet unnamed Sharp Metal. So what we could be dealing with here is another Holy Knight, and even a potential relative of Shanks. But that is far from the only option, and we'll be going into all of the speculation as to who this mystery person is in the next video. Who's the man in the silhouette? Interesting how we all assume it's a man, and that's because it probably is. Look, if One Piece was a standard harem isekai, then I think Shanks' large-chested sister would be the obvious answer, but this is not. It is One Piece. The rule of One Piece is that whenever we see a really cool silhouette, it's probably obscuring a really wacky character. However, the sword being held by this silhouetted individual is very familiar. A couple of commenters have suggested that the sword is actually Ace, which is Roger's old sword, as well as one of the 12 Supreme Grade blades. A sword that seems to have vanished into obscurity. We have absolutely no idea what Roger did with it after becoming the Pirate King, and it does look pretty similar, but you can tell the difference because the silhouetted individual has a flat guard, whereas the guard of Ace was a hemisphere shape. And also, Oda once drew Ace as a human, which I will never not bring up because I love this image. So Ace is out. However, it does pretty much perfectly match Shanks' sword Griffin, which has a flat guard, which is where all of the speculation about the mysterious figure being a Shanks relative comes from. There's really no more to it than that. When the tech spoilers first made their way to the internet, the leakers made it sound like this silhouetted figure was a carbon copy Shanks twin. And that could be how this turns out, but with what we see here, that isn't really the case. What I will say is that this sword also matches the blade that Ray Lee used during the God Valley incident, which is not the same sword that we see him using at any other point in the series. With my personal speculation being that that sword was Griffin and Ray Lee eventually gave it to Shanks, like how Roger gave Shanks the straw hat. But the Figgle connection continues, because Shanks' assumed relative Figgle Garling also uses a very similar, if not identical looking blade. So this one sword is evoking 2 Figglins, and thus pointing us towards a potential third. However, this figure does seem to be much younger than Garling, hence why the Shanks evil twin theory has picked up some steam. I want to be clear, this idea is ridiculous and 99.9% not true, but it is a lot of fun. The idea is that the person who met the Elder Stars at Marijois was not Shanks. We can't actually confirm that it's Shanks because we don't see the side of his face that has the scar, and the cloak is obscuring his missing arm. The Elders also never refer to him by name or even his epithet. They don't say, redhead, but I don't like seeing you here. They're very careful not to identify this person. And you could take this either way, because that last panel is meant to be the big Shanks reveal, so you wouldn't include any indication of who he was before then, or it would ruin the surprise. But also, the Elders indicate that this man may be part of World Noble Society with this line. This is the Reverie. Given your standing, you should have nothing to do with politics. So, indulging the madness for a second, if this was a Shanks twin, then they would likely be a Holy Knight just like Garling. And that standing would mean that he would have nothing to do with politics. He isn't a legislator, he's law enforcement. And to cap off everything, this would mean that the certain pirate that fake Shanks wanted to talk about could very well be the real Shanks, who was the very last character we would have expected after seeing this panel for obvious reasons. That would be the ultimate subversion. The pirate that Shanks wanted to talk about turning out to be himself. And also him turning out not to be himself. Absolute Oda mind melt. My inclination is to believe that this person is going to be affiliated with the world government, because the roster on the last 2 pages of the chapter are mostly packed with characters, good characters I should say, and or neutral characters, very adjacent to good like say Buggy and Kuzan. And you know, the antagonists here, they feel a bit underpowered, so this silhouetted figure could be a secret weapon for them. Although the other major idea that people are bringing up is that this is the man marked by flames, or the burn scar man, depending on which translation you read. And this shot of the man is him getting his sword ready for all of the people he knows are coming after him after hearing Vegapunk's message. Thanks a lot for that, Applegrams. The reason why I'm not so on board with this idea is because I don't think the man marked by flames is a contender for the One Piece. Piece. From the almost nothing we know about him so far, he seems more like a caretaker. Someone guarding the final road poneglyph and waiting for the right person to claim its sweet, juicy history, as opposed to someone with their own agenda and reasons for actively wanting to obtain the One Piece, which I think everyone else on these last 2 pages has, even if we don't know about them yet. And by the way, this question about the silhouetted figure was submitted by a channel member, and if you'd like the chance to end up in a video about fictional pirates, then all you need to do is hit the join button below the video, which also supports our ability to fund our phenomenal channel artists and editors. Marco was smack dab in that page, so besides him remembering Whitebeard, I assumed it meant that Marco was also considered endangered. Alright, this question is missing context. So to be clear, this is the part where Vegapunk is talking about all of the special races, the ones that have been hunted down to near extinction. And in regards to Marco, I mean, obviously, he is the only member of the Pineapple Head tribe that we've encountered. And on top of that, Phoenix's mate, they tend to be exceedingly rare. And this is something I may have missed the first time around, although I think it has more to do with Whitebeard than Marco. Because during the section, again, Vegapunk is talking about the unique races, and that makes Marco think of Whitebeard, which adds a bit more fuel to the idea that Edward Newgate may have been a buccaneer, which I think makes a lot of sense when you look at images of him as a child, because he has that very Return to Bartholomew Kuma-esque physique, or at least part buccaneer, maybe a quarter. It would explain a lot. Although in this case, I do think the simpler answer is that Vegapunk's words reminded Marco of when Whitebeard told him about the former kingdom atop the Red Line inhabited by Lunarians, which then transitions into King's reaction. I find it odd that the final page of the chapter has all the Yonko, then related characters, but no commanders. But it shows Aokiji. I think it's hinting that he might betray Blackbeard. I think that just confirms what we all 99% knew, that Kuzan is a man with his own icy agenda. After failing to become a fleet admiral and seeing the direction the Marines were going in under the rulership of Sakazuki, I could believe that Kuzan's last-ditch thought was, well, the only way to fix this mess is to find the One Piece. Best get going. And so he set out to do the impossible. But given that he was only one man, he needed to find an emperor to align himself with. Big Mom and Kaido probably weren't great options. One, because of their record, they've been emperors for God knows how long now and haven't made any progress. Plus, they're not the most reasonable of individuals, but Blackbeard, this Blackbeard, he is a very exciting entity, making waves in this world and genuinely pushing for the One Piece, despite only having been an emperor for less than 2 years. You also need to remember that Luffy wasn't an option at the time. He was still time skipping. I'm not sure why Kuzan wouldn't try Shanks though. That does feel like a more natural pairing, although it would be far less exciting narratively. But maybe Kuzan knows something about the will of D that led him to join the only emperor at the time who had a D in their name. Because the more you know about the D, the more you tend to see them as a safer bet than all the non-Ds, including Shanks. It's also worth mentioning Sabo. The commenter said that there were no commanders on this page, and that's kind of true, but not really. Sabo is the Revolutionary Army equivalent of a commander, but he also has his own thing going on at the moment, with people all around the world starting to idolize him as the Flame Emperor, thus giving him this weird sort of semi-fifth emperor status, because people are much more excited about him than they are of Dragon, for I think very reasonable reasons. And Sabo is kind of on the verge of stumbling into his own faction. That's one direction that Oda could take with him. For that to happen though, I imagine he'd need to have some sort of disagreement with Dragon, and I don't think there are any seeds of that at the moment. Sabo seems very, very loyal to the Revolutionary Army. And thinking about it, Garling also acts as a commander for Imu, so there's like 3 commanders on this page. Although it would be interesting to find out if Garling even knows about Imu, because most world nobles don't, and they've been looking to the 5 geriatrics for absolute authority. So what is the reaction of the Holy Knights going to be when they discover, it's an Imu? I was surprised by the lack of Supernova in the lineup for the race. A bit unfortunate for them. I'm not particularly surprised because we were told flat out that both the Kid and Heart Pirates were eradicated, although I feel like if this announcement had happened right after Wano, then both Kid and Law would have been included. However, I do think that this solidifies that they are now out of the race. They both still have important roles to play going forward, but they aren't candidates to claim the One Piece anymore. They're glorified FedEx agents delivering poneglyph rubbings to Shanks and Blackbeard. This chapter validates Katarina Devon's scene earlier. The other elders weren't there to see that Saturn was defeated and sent to the sea. So I think the suggestion here is that no one's sees Saturn drown, which gives Katarina Devon an opportunity to rock up to the world government and pretend to be him. I doubt that Devon would be able to infiltrate the Elders by pretending to be Saturn though. That would be such a risky game of high class Among Us, and she'd probably be figured out pretty quickly, especially if Devon isn't privy to their telepathy system. But even if Saint Saturn does die here, his art will return down the line in the form of Katarina Devon. Because if Saturn or indeed multiple Elder Stars die, then there is no way that the world government is reporting that. It would send the world into too much chaos and raise all sorts of unpleasant questions like, hey, why were the old men on that island in the first place? What was going on? And you know that makes Saturn a hell of a lot easier to impersonate, considering that 1, the real Saturn isn't around to object, and 2, no one else realizes that he's supposed to be dead. It would be an even bigger boss move if the other 5 Elders got taken out as well, because then Katarina Devon could pretend to be the sole survivor with absolutely no one to call her out. It's just getting so ironic hearing insects from the mouth of a spider. So spiders aren't insects, but the general irony is still there. And you know, what I love is if each of the 5 Elders had a quirk of referring to humans as the thing that they themselves are. Like Saturn calls all humans insects despite being a spider, and then maybe Jupiter refers to humans as worms, disgusting wriggly worms. Topman Walkyrie could refer to everyone as swine. Marcus Mars considers them all to be poultry, and as for Ethan, I don't know. Maybe he has something against bald people or even bald horses specifically. Maybe that's his thing. It almost worked. The 5 Elders have purposely made it impossible to locate the One Piece for many people, as you need to read the poneglyphs, but the 5 Elders made sure to wipe out anybody who was truly capable of doing such a thing. So all of that is true, almost. Yeah, they missed a few people here and there. But my question is why they didn't seek out the One Piece for themselves. If claiming the One Piece allows someone to decide the direction of the world, then that sounds like a pretty worthwhile endeavor that we should at least, send a trusted strike force to look into. Maybe the Holy Knights. And also maybe reconsidering our decision making, like say not murdering every single O'Haran scholar, so that you could instead use them to help you translate the ancient text, or at the very least not destroy all of their books, because some of those books are probably textbooks that could teach them how to translate the ancient text for themselves. It's your classic world government short-sightedness. Shoot first and think about dealing with ancient prophecies later. And I reckon if they'd been slightly less trigger happy, then they could have solved this whole One Piece mystery by now. Although with that in mind, I do wonder if Emu is actually capable of reading the ancient text, if indeed he has been around since ancient times. In that case, a strict genocidal policy would be a good move, because it would leave him as the sole individual able to decipher them. Though it still doesn't explain why he hasn't, tried to. And if the world government aren't joining this race, then they're gonna need someone who can read the poneglyphs. Luffy has a Robin, Blackbeard has a Pudding. Shanks has a good sense of direction and probably already knows where Laugh Tale is because Roger already went there. So the world government are going to be very behind without that ability. Isn't it a bit weird that Oda showed us Vivi, Shirahoshi, and the 2 Skypian girls when talking about the weapons? The young one was gifted with mantra after all. I don't think it's weird at all, and I don't think you do either. It made perfect sense because this is when Vegapunk was talking about the ancient weapons, and so he showed major ancient weapon characters. However, that could mean that there's a bit more to Isa that shouldn't be underestimated. Because thinking about it, Isa is kind of like the OG Momonosuke. Momo was this fated child able to hear the voice of all things for reasons. And Isa was also exactly that before mantra was revealed to be observation haki. And Isa was just born different because she's genuinely in the top 10 observation haki users probably in the world. But there really could be something more going on here. In Isa's Viviacard databook entry, it was noted that her observation haki allowed her to, quote, hear the voice of everyone from all over the island. Those are very specific words and aren't used with any other haki user, and it could be hinting that Isa is actually using the voice of all things, and we just mistake it for observation haki because they do similar things. With the voice of all things being a naturally gifted power, unlike observation haki, which in every other case we've seen has had to be trained. Please do not forget about the wonderful color spread for the 27th anniversary of the manga. I hadn't actually considered that this was the chapter that was released on the 27th anniversary of One Piece. And as a thanks for reading, Oda gave the fan base a giant Nami to simp over because giant women are very much in fashion right now on the internet, which I attribute to Lady D from Resident Evil Village. I really like it though because this style, it's much messier than most color spreads, as in the coloring in particular is much more raw and splotchy than usual. Like this jagged line you see running down Nami's leg isn't usually what Oda would go for. He tends to prefer clean, slightly flatter and more seamlessly blended color. So I do really like this spread stylistically. I always enjoy being able to see little hints of the instrument of the artist. I just hope that it's an aesthetic choice and not an issue caused by Oda's ongoing health concerns, and that perhaps coloring in his regular style might have been too intensive for him. But I do find it funny because the most detailed part of this color spread is definitely this area. Oda spent a lot of time perfecting the contours of Nami's breast and even did a nice blend into that classic anime skin shine. And comparing that coloring to the rest of her body, you can just tell that Oda spent quite a bit of time here. And why not? Nami has always been Oda's priority. That's why he married a Nami cosplayer. I want Luffy to be able to use his powers without limits towards the end. Do you think that will happen? I think that's where we are heading with Endgame Luffy. Right now, Gear 5th does still have some restrictions, although they're more minor annoyances than anything. It's like an ability with a cooldown. Luffy can't endlessly spam it, there are forced breaks, and eating food can make the cooldown shorter. Then again, it is still possible that Luffy has already achieved his peak. He did say so himself on Wano. Peak freedom, something. However, this is a shonen manga, and traditional shonen rules state that we would need one more big power-up to overcome the finalist of villains. But Egghead has also showed us that part of Luffy's abilities has to do with liberating others and allowing them to fight as freely as him, which is seen in a very literal sense with Bonnie adopting Gear 5th. But our big push towards the end is about Luffy liberating the world. So it might be less that he finds another new way to fight without limits, but more that he's able to spread that power to others. Not necessarily by making everyone transform into white-haired sun gods, but by breaking that mental barrier that stops them hitting their full potential. You probably have some mental barrier going on right now, and you know what I say? I say stop it. Do the thing you want to do right now. Because this is the end of the video, and look, I'd appreciate it if the thing you wanted to do was subscribe to this channel for consistent injections of One Piece culture administered directly into your YouTube feed. Oda has just unleashed ancient Haki onto this very unprepared, submissive, and breedable modern world. So this chapter was pretty damn wild. A lot of real big things happened, but the bigger things were actually the smaller things. Like a lot of stuff that you may or may not have noticed in that Joy Boy flashback. It is deceptively simple. There is stuff. But this chapter kicks off strong from the get-go, and right from where we left off, examining the 12 candidates to find the One Piece. And here Oda highlights 3 of them, Buggy, Blackbeard, and Kobe. And Kobe is definitely one of my favorite moments of the chapter, because I've solidly gotten on board with the Kobe train lately, and hearing him so seriously state that he's going to stop Luffy's dream gave me chills. Because I get it, it's Kobe. He really doesn't look like he belongs here. What chances he got? But it's the way that Oda draws him. Those eyes are the same sort of determination I see in Luffy when he says he's going to become the Pirate King. And so when I see this, I believe Kobe every bit as much as I believe Luffy. Which isn't something I expected. I was thinking something more along the lines of Kobe seeing a bigger picture and allying himself with Luffy, but I like this infinitely better. Because now there's the potential drama of the very first person that Luffy liberated now becoming the greatest obstacle to achieving his dream. And it does make sense. Right now the whole world is kind of up for grabs, so for Kobe to enact his honest justice, he needs to be the person to claim the One Piece. And I imagine that the public are very much behind him, because Oda showcases a lot of citizens around the world terrified of the idea that a pirate could choose the direction of the planet. So now is actually a very galvanizing time for the Marines, which could also very much assist Sakazuki's desire of very active and quite brutal justice. What we're entering is a wartime state, and Sakazuki, he's not the greatest fleet admiral during peace. However, he's the kind of leader who people really rally around in times of desperation, and I would not be surprised to see his support skyrocket. But this section is wonderfully followed by Comrade Buggy giving another unbelievably charismatic speech by claiming that the One Piece, no mates, it won't be mine, that One Piece is gonna be ours. It really is almost like he's running for office. And I dare say that Crocodile is coming around to this idea, because he doesn't look anywhere near as upset as usual. Vegapunk's message may have actually reinvigorated Crocodile into seeing this whole Buggy situation as a blessing in disguise, and perhaps solidified his personal drive and candidacy in the upcoming biggest fight battle in the series that would put even Onigashima to shame. The raid on Onigashima featured over 100 named characters, all coming together to fight battle one another for supremacy and the right to dictate which little girls get food and which little girls get none. But here's something that I'm very disappointed about in this chapter. When we catch up with the Blackbeard pirates, Caribou is not in a barrel, and this is outrageous. Although probably not from his perspective, this is probably quite a nice change. And if anything, the Blackbeard pirates definitely treating him better than the Straw Hats did. Even though Blackbeard does state that he'll kill him if the information isn't good enough, but Caribou just so happens to know the locations of 2 ancient weapons, so I think that he'll be just fine. But I'm going to skip around a bit now because I need to talk about this Joy Boy flashback, which is extremely exciting because this is our first true window into what the world looks like during the Void Century. Previously, we've only seen abstract glimpses of history told by unreliable narrators who were definitely not there, but this is a clear and proper vision of the past. So this flashback, right, it seems so simple, but it is packed with a ridiculous amount of detail. To start with Emmett, there are 2 wildly interesting things about him. And I originally thought that I was going crazy when I saw this because I was like, how did I miss this? But he has a big ol' X on his arm in exactly the same sort of way that the Straw Hats marked themselves during Alabasta, which went on to incidentally become the sign of eternal friendship with Vivi and Karoo. And again, I thought I was losing my mind here, but I've gone back on Egghead Island and I don't think that this mark has ever been visible on Emmett. And a lot of that might be because of how Oda tends to draw him with these very dramatic shadows that tend to obscure the arm in question. But this is not an accident, this is not a coincidence. Oda has done this on purpose. And now in the future, I somewhat expect a scene where Joy Boy's crew mark themselves much like the Straw Hats did, and it could even be because of Emmett. The X on his arm could have been a design choice by whoever engineered him, one which Joy Boy saw and said, bruh, cool mark. And you know what? To show our friendship, I'ma put one on me. And that also makes modern day Emmett's situation quite sad, because that mark has now potentially been rusted away or overgrown by debris or otherwise obscured, indicating that the time of that friendship is very much not now. The second interesting thing about Emmett is that he's wearing clothes. I had no idea that the Emmett we'd been experiencing up until now was nude. Very scandalous. But it looks like his clothing actually came from Elbaph, because he's got the same sort of furry overalls that we've seen Broggy in particular wear, which also matches Emmett's general aesthetic, because his headgear slash, I guess, actual head looks a lot like the Viking-esque helmets of Elbaph as well. I don't think this necessarily means that Emmett is from Elbaph. It's probably just the one nation on the planet that makes clothes in his size, and it might be a situation where Joy Boy's crew traveled to Elbaph, then they proved themselves as great fun-time warriors of Warland, and the giants honored Emmett with the garb of a warrior. But speaking of giants, here is a big thing that I didn't originally notice because it is so small, which is that this chapter very casually confirms that Joy Boy was not a giant. And that's been a leading theory primarily due to that mysterious giant straw hat on Marijwa that Emu periodically goes to visit every now and then. He keeps it in like a giant fridge sort of thing. Don't know quite what it is. It's just always frosty in there. And we know it's not a case where, say, Joy Boy, a giant, has eaten the mini fruit, which has happened twice in One Piece non-canon material. And we know this because Joy Boy is heavily hinted at being the previous user of Luffy's devil fruit. So I'm now wondering again who this giant straw hat belonged to. And then it struck me, would it not have potentially belonged to Emmett? And Emu acquired it when Emmett attacked Marijwa. Now obviously we don't see it in the short flashback panel given to us, but also this is not a flashback. It is Vegapunk explaining vague history. So this visual is not necessarily to be taken as reliable. As for why a robot would need sun protection, look, it probably wouldn't, unless it was a very poorly made robot, but it would be a symbol of Joy Boy, something that he could have gifted his crew before the inevitable happened, because he does seem very aware that things are not going to end well. And at the moment, the only other thought I have is that we are not looking far enough back. There's a temptation to believe that everything started with Joy Boy, but the origin of this will goes back to truly ancient times with the sun god Nika, who, as an Elbaphian god, was much more likely to be a giant. So maybe this hat is even older than we think, and it's what the original Nika once wore in those extremely ancient days. How did the world government end up with it? Dunno. But also, if it didn't belong to Emmett, the answer to that and also many other questions is still dunno. By the way, did everyone catch that Joy Boy is sitting on a suspiciously cube-shaped object that is very evocative of a poneglyph? It's just such a sharply cubed object in an environment that is otherwise very not cube-friendly. And it's also pretty much smack bang the exact right size for a poneglyph compared to a human, assuming that's now what Joy Boy is. Which indicates that this flashback does occur in the final days of Joy Boy after the great scattering of the mystery cubes. But here's a crazy thought. What if the island we're seeing right here is Laugh Tale? And when we get there, this is a final poneglyph with a message from Joy Boy waiting for the lucky person to find it. And as for the content of the conversation, it's about making sense of the chaos that just happened with the knot, as Joy Boy appears to have infused his disgustingly powerful haki into it. And we'll talk about that with the Egghead stuff in a bit, because Joy Boy was clearly just on a different level to anything else we've seen. But this knot concept isn't new to One Piece. It didn't just come out of nowhere. We actually first saw it after Nami was seen to Witheria. And while there, she got very sad and quite quite a bit violent. So to cheer her up / calm her down, old mate Harada said, "Oi, oi, 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 look at this wind knot," which is a really cool device because the wind knot had 3 levels. You undo 1 knot and it creates a lovely gentle breeze. Then you undo 2 and it becomes a powerful gust. And then on the 3rd one, you create a full force gale. And I can't help but think Joy Boy only did 1 knot. Imagine if he did 3. So magical knots are nothing new, but there is something very comforting about using a knot because knots represent safety and stability. So for Joy Boy to be handing Emmett a symbol of safety is a pretty solid maneuver when he's claiming that, "Mate, I'll protect you from beyond the grave." And the last detail I'd like to explore with the flashback is Joy Boy's leg, which looks extremely thin, particularly compared to his other leg, and it's got me wondering if Joy Boy had a peg leg. Other than the eye patch, that's probably the most stereotypically piratey thing possible one could have. And if he's the first pirate, dude, mate, you've got to have something. It might be an eye patch. This could be the eye patch pirate we've been waiting for, but a peg leg would be pretty damn cool as well. Although contrary to what I just said, it might just be a weird perspective thing because Joy Boy's right arm also looks very tiny and thin compared to his left. So maybe it's nothing after all, but look, I don't know, I can dream. But moving to modern day, Luffy and Emmett talk a bit more and the question has now been answered. Luffy is not literally Joy Boy. Emmett just says that he looks almost exactly like Joy Boy, which is why I find it kind of funny that Oda has decided to keep Joy Boy so silhouetted in this flashback because we all know what he looks like. It's Luffy. And I guess the silhouette at this point seems like more of a formality because Oda takes official introductions very seriously. So he's got a page or 2 in mind to showcase Joy Boy fully for the first time when it eventually happens, and it would be a bit of a waste to blow most of our load in this short flashback. So I get it, silhouette. But Emmett also apologizes for not being able to make Joy Boy king, which is such an intriguing statement. One, because it's another parallel between Luffy and Joy Boy, both aiming to become kings, but you do need to ask, a king of what? The dude was already the first pirate. They didn't exist before him. So I don't know if the concept of pirate king is going to be at all relevant for the next 800 years. One other option could also be that Joy Boy wanted to become the king of the world, which is effectively what Imu is right now, as well as the ambition held by Rocksteady Zebek, who may very well have been following in the footsteps of Joy Boy there. But I don't really buy that. It seems a bit too antagonistic. And also the responsibility of ruling a whole world, mate, that really isn't in line with the theme of freedom, which I can only imagine that Joy Boy was pursuing as well. And then Emmett asks for Luffy's name, to which he says the line, "I'm Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm gonna be the Pirate King," with Emmett lingering on that there D, because it's at this moment that Emmett knows exactly what he needs to do here, because he knows exactly what that D means and how it relates to Joy Boy. I have a video coming out about this soon, but the speculation here is that the D was a symbol of friendship created by Joy Boy's crew, and not a name held by everyone in the Ancient Kingdom. The idea is that it's more similar to the X's that the Straw Hats drew on their arms during Alabasta. This is a theory that I saw on Daxake's channel, and I very much subscribe to it. And if true, hearing that D means that Emmett knows that Luffy is his Nakama from another Mamama, hence why he's choosing to protect Luffy the same way that Joy Boy chose to protect him. And these elderly prunes had no idea what was about to hit them, and still might not quite have an idea because what happened here is a bit unclear. It looks like after Emmett released the knot, the demonic powers of the elders were disintegrated, and then everyone except for Saturn appeared back in the Room of Authority. Except for Marcus Mars, who is hilariously just waiting for them on the couch, looking very disgruntled and upset. He's got that face that a teenage girl makes when she sees her rival making a move on the boy that she likes at school. And that tells us quite a lot, because that means that Marcus Mars got sent here via the Straw Hat combo attack. So that probably gives us a solid limitation on the ability that Saint Saturn used to summon each of the elders. One being that there's probably a strictly defined area in which they can operate, and Marcus being sent outside of that area is like falling off a stage and smash. You're out. Now sit on the couch and you just think about what a failure you are. It also adds evidence to the idea that Saturn is in fact a Devil Fruit user, because Haki was able to dispel his effects, being the teleportation of his old man friends, but it also forced Saint Saturn out of his spider form. And if we hadn't seen the empty Room of Authority before, I'd be tempted to think that what Saturn did was summon demonic clones of the other elders that could be controlled remotely. But we know that the 5 elders were actually there, but I suppose they were tethered to the powers of Saturn. And when those powers got cancelled, the old men got packed up and shipped back to Old Manistan. But there is another option. Imu himself, in a brilliant panel, is shown feeling Joy Boy's haki. And it was a mighty big burst, but not something that Imu should have felt from all the way at the top of the red line, which adds a lot of weight to the idea that the elders could be satellites created by Imu and his demonic powers, much like how Vegapunk created his satellites through science, with each elder representing a chosen aspect of Imu, which is why they all have their specialties, why they all have similar abilities, and why Imu has felt their experience here, because he is connected to them, a feeling which has Imu rather shook, to say the least, because I don't think there is any other way to interpret this other than fear, which is an odd emotion for your big, bad, evil world man to be feeling. For example, usually when Luffy reappears in front of villains, they mostly just get annoyed and angry at his tenacity as well as their failure to kill him. But Imu is lacking that confidence. It's as if he knows that he's done something very bad, like say betrayed Joy Boy and didn't anticipate ever having to face him again. And you know what? I'm just gonna say it. This is very Spandam behavior. It's the exact sort of response that he would have had to one of his plans failing and sensing the potential of being punched by some really strong people as a result. Here's why this makes me nervous though. Usually it's our heroes who take the initial L against the big bad guys. Our heroes go in, realize they're in over their heads, take a beating, and return to dramatically overcome their obstacle. But as we've done with so many things in Egghead, what's happened is that dynamic has been flipped. And now the elders and Imu are in the position of protagonists having suffered a bitter defeat. That panel of the elders returning in particular reminds me of a sports manga where a team loses and uses this bitter defeat as profound motivation to win the sports game finals next year. They lost this year because they were unprepared, they were rusty, and they were not playing at 100%. But next time they will be an order of magnitude more driven and dangerous. And also we won't have a big robot to save us. So before I move on to the big conclusion, I do need to point out that this week we have a very special cover page. Oda has elected to draw Smoker rather dramatically, I might add. And this is in honor of the final chapter of My Hero Academia also being released this week, which is now concluded with a whopping total of 430 chapters, which is a phenomenal run. I'm not going to go too deeply into it because this is a One Piece video, but the reason why Oda chose to draw Smoker as a tribute here is because the author of My Hero Academia, Kohei Horikoshi, actually sent Oda some Smoker fan art when he was 15 years old, which got showcased in the Usopp Gallery of Volume 77, which is this one. But just let me repeat this conceptually though. The author of a manga that has ended after an astonishing 430 chapters was 15 years old during the events of Dressrosa. And Oda remembered, which is why in honor of Horikoshi, Oda did his take on his fan art, thus becoming official art and no longer fan anything, which I just think was a really cool thing to do. But back to this chapter, Egghead Island seems all but over at this point. The Straw Hats and the giant warrior pirates are setting sail, the Marines can't chase them because they've mostly been knocked out, and 4 of the 5 elders have been sent back to the retirement home. Saint Saturn is still there on his own, now face to face with Emmett, and there's a very sad final panel of this chapter where Emmett's eyes have gone out, implying that he may have left this world, or more likely that he's just run out of energy again. So this might not be the last we see of Emmett in the modern day, but that also depends on what Saturn does, because I doubt that he'd elect to just leave Emmett intact. But barring one final twist, I think that we're about to step into the transition chapters that will eventually deposit us in Elbaph for the remainder of the year, and who knows how long after that. All I know right now is that Egghead has been a surprisingly long but very necessary burst of fresh air into a post-101 piece, and I would be more than satisfied with this being the conclusion as we look onwards to Elbaph. Koby officially becoming determined to stop Luffy is the real motivation he needed to strive to Admiral level strength. Koby has been lacking that key aspect of drive, or I guess a better way to put it is lacking something tangible for the future to work towards, which is what Luffy's had since episode 1, with believing that becoming the Pirate King is the key to his dream, and the key to becoming the Pirate King is the One Piece, and the key to that is to find the mystery cubes and etc. Or Zoro knowing that tangibly he achieves his desire as soon as he defeats Mihawk, and even Nami has a tangible point, with her having drawn a map of the whole world being her dream. And I know that Koby has stated that he's wanted to become an admiral, but that's like Luffy saying, I want to become the Pirate King, and then not knowing that and how. You know, there is no admiral version of the One Piece that you find and everyone applauds and goes, well, Admiral Koby, good job. So his reasons why he wants to become an admiral, and more importantly, his steps towards that, have always been very vague. So I do like that Koby now has something to focus on. And it's also giving us that Roger Garp dynamic that Luffy, in my opinion, has has been missing to this point, that serious marine rival relentlessly chasing him. And I do know that a lot of people are very skeptical about this, because up until recently, the strength gap between Luffy and Kobe can only be described as gaping. But if Luffy has taught us nothing else, it's that you cannot underestimate determination and tenacity and willpower. Well, three of them are kind of the same thing in this world. Haki is literally manifested willpower that you can use to punch people. And if Kobe has that will, then he will be a challenge. Although ultimately, what I think we might be gearing towards is another God Valley incident, where Kobe will enter the battlefield in the role of Garp, intending to stop Luffy, but forming an alliance with him to bring down Blackbeard, or whoever the major threat ends up being. But it's pretty much got to be Blackbeard, right? Kobe has the will of Garp, Luffy has the will of Roger, and Blackbeard almost certainly has the will of Rocks. On another note, I also think that Kobe's declaration is a massive sign of respect to Luffy, because after hearing this from Vegapunk, Kobe's mind doesn't go to anyone else. He's not like, damn, I'ma have to stop that dragon or that Sakazuki, or even that Blackbeard. He hears this and he goes, I'm sorry, Luffy, but I need to stop you, because I believe that you're the one most likely to make it happen. Why didn't Emmett use the Haki knot 200 years ago at Marijois? I imagine it's because he had nothing to protect. Because despite it being ever so powerful, this knot is a defensive maneuver. It was given to Emmett to protect him, so if his life was ever in danger, he could use it. But the situation on Marijois was very different. Emmett was the one attacking, potentially even lashing out in pain, and not really concerned with his own life or needing to defend himself. Put simply, the time wasn't right. And even if Emmett thought it was, then Fate probably would have done the thing it is that Fate does, and have him run out of battery right before he released the knot. I just realized this chapter opened up the concept that you can store up excess Haki. So possibly this will be Luffy's next game-breaking power boost. I don't know about it being Luffy's power boost, but it does open up a ton of possibilities. And one of my initial questions would be, why isn't this used more? If you can imbue what are essentially Haki bombs, then why don't the Marines weaponize this by making a farm of Vice Admirals, imbuing their Haki into cannonballs or something on a daily basis? I suppose it might not be a commonly known use of Haki, may have been a technique that was lost in ancient times, and it also might be something that you can only do with Conqueror's Haki, of which there are not many uses. But to be fair, I do think we've seen this before, because during Onigashima, Kaido did mention that Enma felt like it had the presence of Kozuki Oden within it. And after seeing this, I think it practically confirms that Oden did a very similar thing to Joy Boy. And he also likely did this because Oden knew that he was going to die. Because for whatever reason, Oden still had his swords with him after he was captured by Kaido and sentenced to death, so he could have used that opportunity to imbue both of them for the future protection of Hiyori and Momonosuke, and then given them to Toki. And maybe that means that this Haki bomb is something that you can craft only once. After you part with your Haki, aka your willpower, aka your will, then you are left completely Hakiless, because your will is now entrusted within something else. You don't need it anymore, you've put it over there. In which case, Emmett's action here was the last remaining will of Joy Boy, very appropriately used to allow Luffy to escape and put him on the path to his final handful of islands to bring about the dawn of the world and all of that. This chapter also confirms that the five elders aren't the only ones who know about Imu, since there's a shadowy someone who calls out to Imu after Imu collapses from Joy Boy's Haki. So this is referring to the very worried shadowy figure who we saw call out to Imu. And I skipped talking about this in the chapter review because I assumed that everyone remembered this person, because we have actually seen this person before, but to be fair, it is very easy to forget. It was during Imu's introduction in chapter 908, there's a wide shot of the Chamber of Flowers where a shadowy figure is bowing to Imu and reporting that the five elders had arrived for their meeting about which light it was that was going to be erased from history. At the moment, this person is only known to us as Imu's servant, which is a name that we've given them, and also an assumption we've given them just because of the behavior, the bowing and the reporting. But at this stage, this person is more mysterious than Imu himself, because at least we've seen Imu's eyes, and we've never seen anything more than a blob in the dark from this figure. Although the anime revealed a lot more in this regard, actually giving this person a warm color scheme and what looks like, but almost certainly isn't, a bowler hat. And her voice sounds like a woman. It's quite a rich voice as well, like a very mature woman. So who knows, maybe this is the queen to Imu's king, the person he settled for after not being able to achieve his Nefertari Lily related desires. But I would say don't take the anime design or voice as set in stone right now. Oda has a lot less input into the anime than most people would like to believe, and so the anime quite frequently needs to take a lot of liberties and make a lot of guesses with stuff like this. Like with the whole revealing that the 1% person Hawkins was talking about was Drake, which turned out to be wrong. And I think that her design at the very least will be pretty radically different when she is eventually revealed. But speaking of the anime, we can now set our clocks to a fairly major event. Now that Joy Boys had confirmed dialogue in the manga, we now have approximately 1 year before before we hear what he sounds like in the anime. And you really need to wonder if they're going to use Mayumi Tanaka and just have him sound like Luffy. But whatever Joy Boy sounds like, it's going to tell us a lot. I don't have any original thoughts that haven't already been stated in this comment section, but I would greatly appreciate if I would make it into the video anyway. Just pretend like I made a good point. That is a great point, and thank you for sharing it. It kind of seems that Joy Boy was standing on one of the pillars in Zou and not a poneglyph. Alright, so that's actually a good point. I may have jumped the gun with the whole idea of Joy Boy standing on a poneglyph, because looking at the Zou landscape, I guess Joy Boy could be standing on one of those colossal pillars, and in which case he would need to be a massive person because those pillars are deceptively huge. Like we're talking Joy Boy is a giant sort of thing. And I do think it would make all the sense in the world for Joy Boy and Emmett to be riding Zunesha. But what still gives me pause for thought is that in the manga panel, what we're seeing looks like it could be water in the background along with seabirds. And if we're riding Zunesha sitting at, 15 kilometers high into the sky, then we shouldn't be seeing either of those. I've also seen a lot of people speculating that Joy Boy could have been a buccaneer. Because of the size comparison to Emmett, he does look much bigger than, your average human that Oda depicts. But I wouldn't take sizing in One Piece too seriously. Oda is notoriously inconsistent, and sizes tend to vary depending on what makes the page look most balanced. And also, from what we've been led to believe, buccaneers are absolute units. Big, bulky, well-rounded hunks of pain-immune meat, and this Joy Boy doesn't really fit in with that at all. He's got a very Luffy level of scrawniness happening. Can't believe you missed Nami confirming that Edison is with the Straw Hats. Okay, so I'm pretty sure I missed this because I don't think it actually happened. When the Straw Hats land, I think it's Sanji who asks if Nami's okay. He says Nami-san, and she responds with, yeah, Sanji mate, I'm okay. However, Atlas and Edison, ellipsis, indicating that bad things have happened to them, like death. And delivering the bad news for Atlas, I understand, because the Straw Hats did watch her incredibly glorious sacrifice. But announcing the loss of Edison is a different matter, because Nami shouldn't have any idea about his current whereabouts. And if this is Oda's way of confirming that Edison is dead, then all I have to say is bad, manga man. You need to show me that death, because I do not trust your death shenaniganry in One Piece. Every elder except Saturn got teleported back to the authority room. I wonder what Katarina Devon is gonna do. I mean, that's the question, isn't it? Saint Saturn is still very much in danger, and it would definitely beat Katarina Devon's advantage if some sort of, oh no, accident were to happen to Saturn on the way back from Egghead. We're really gonna have to get rid of him at some point if Katarina Devon is going to use her Saturn visage effectively, and it would probably need to be a quiet removal from existence on his way back to Marijois. Because if something big happens and say he explodes into like a million old man bits, then no one's gonna be fooled by Devon because they saw the thing happen. I noticed that you suddenly came around from the stance of Vegapunk's message turning people against the world government to the message suddenly being a boon for the Marines. Quite the about face. Not really. I feel like I've been very consistent on this. For the past few weeks, in fact, the past few months, I've been saying that this message will cause a rift within the world. Half of the people are going to see this and turn against the world government, whilst the other half are going to see it and double down on their commitment to the world government. And the reactions around the planet have proved this. We've seen people start to seriously question the world government, and others dismiss this message as an act of evil intent on destroying peace, especially within the Marines, with each of them now needing to immediately answer the question of what their own personal sense of justice is, which is definitely going to galvanize support for Sakazuki, because half of them are going to turn to his extremist views that they may have been a bit uncertain about before. But now they're going to look at him in context with this message and go, mate, that's the guy that gets things done. I'm gonna follow him. The guy who's been saying all along that evil needs to be eradicated. He was right this whole time. Whereas the other half, or maybe even a smaller percentage than that, are probably going to take the sword route. By the way, since Mars was alone in Marijois, he was finally able to sit down despite his constant punishment. So for anyone unaware, Oda has had a policy when drawing the Five Elders that Marcus Mars must always be standing. The reason for this is aesthetics. It's more interesting to have a variety of positions at a variety of heights to make the panels more visually engaging. Nothing more boring than just seeing a bunch of old men sitting down. Let's have one of them standing. Mate, that's interesting. But in the latest SBS, Oda gave us a much more fun reason, which is that Mars never does his elder homework, and so the other four elders punish him by always making him stand up like a bad student in a classroom. So this is actually the first time that we have ever seen Marcus Mars sitting down. And he was only able to do so because the other four weren't there to enforce his punishment. And because we're talking about weird, obscure stuff, this chapter actually contains one of the most obscure references that I think has ever been put into One Piece. And it has to do with these three guys. Something that you may have noticed in this chapter are three pirates with extremely odd and detailed designs. And this is a One Piece reference so deep that even I, man who talks about fictional pirates on the internet, had never heard of before now. But these three were born during an event known as the Kokin Muso Kaizoku Daikaisen, which can be translated as the historical Great Maritime War of the Pirates. This was an event held by Shueisha in about 1999 to 2000, and essentially weekly Shonen Jump readers had to go and create their own crew of 3 pirates, each with their own respective stats like an RPG, who would then face off against other pirate crews in their prefectures, and then all of the finalists would face Eiichiro Oda's crew, which I believe consisted of the original trio of Luffy, Zoro, and Nami. And one crew did manage to defeat Oda, which were the Bakudan pirates, who Oda subsequently drew with Luffy, Zoro, and Nami as a prize. However, Oda demanded retribution for this humiliation, and so he put together a team. He enlisted his mentor Nobuhiro Watsuki, mangaka of Rurouni Kenshin, and good friend Hiroyuki Takei, the mangaka of Shaman King. And together these 3 authors created their ultimate trio known as the Funbari Curry Pirates. And those are the 3 dudes that we see in this chapter, who are now canon to the One Piece world. So, the big question, will we get new bounties? I can't see a situation where the Straw Hats, or at least Luffy, don't get a bounty increase. Because globally, he's done so much more damage on Egghead Island than during any other arc. Even during Wano, where 2 Emperors of the Sea were beaten. And all of it is very public knowledge, the most public it's ever been. The world government can't cover this up. It was already reported that Luffy was the mastermind behind the siege of Egghead Island. And if it's also been reported that Law and Kid have been defeated by Blackbeard and Shanks, then it really feels like Luffy, Blackbeard, and Shanks all need something that's going to elevate them into the final saga. But also, I don't know. In terms of real world time, even though it's almost been 2 years, it still feels a bit early to me for a bounty change. I mean, I say that, but the change between Luffy getting 500 million at the end of Dressrosa and the rise to 1.5 billion berries after Whole Cake Island was about 2 years as well. But also, if not now, then when? Waiting for him to become the Pirate King might be too late, because that could be the point at which the world government and thus the bounty system has already collapsed. It might also be a situation where we don't see the increase immediately, like we set sail to Elbaph, isolate ourselves on the Kingdom of Giants, and then later on, learn what Luffy's bounty change was as a result of the events of Egghead Island, and maybe even taking whatever happens on Elbaph into consideration as well. I feel like the knot in the rope is a reference to Hitotsunagi, the rope linking all men. Joy Boy is reaching out and linking people through time using his ropes. Alright, so this is an incredibly underrated and very clever comment. I didn't even think of this, and genuinely thank you so much for bringing it to my attention. And for everyone else, just prepare to have your minds blown. I've explored this in other videos before, but one of the biggest mysteries surrounding the actual One Piece itself is the fact that we don't even know how to spell One Piece in Japanese. When written in Japanese, the One Piece is the Hitotsunagi no Daiho. Daiho meaning great hidden treasure, and Hitotsunagi meaning, well, we don't know. Because that part of the name is written in hiragana, and that is far too vague. It could mean any number of different things that without kanji, we really have no way of even beginning to narrow it down. For example, Hitotsunagi could mean one sea at peace, which has been the leading theory, particularly because it contains the word sea and one sea. Oh, one piece, get rid of the red line, that's what you got one sea, it makes sense. However, the second leading theory is that Hitotsunagi can also mean that which connects people together, much like a rope now connecting Joy Boy directly to Luffy across 800 years of history. And perhaps the One Piece itself is something similar, just a very simple object or concept designed to connect people, and the Hitotsunagi ends up taking on that meaning. And just to add more fuel to this fire, because we are going to burn this whole video down, from the very beginning, even the One Piece logo has been connected together by rope with a knot secured in the anchor. It's a sort of thing that you really can't pull off with the English language. Our language demands too much specificity at all times, whereas Japanese is much more chill. You can have sentences like, you know, the thing with the maybes at the place. And if you want to know more about the intricacies of what the Hitotsunagi no Daiho could be, then I've made this fun video, which you should absolutely go and watch, and also subscribe to the channel, like the video, donate to my Patreon, and don't forget to leave your credit card details in the comments, but email me the pin so that no one but me has access. Thank you very much. We are finally going to Elbaph. Prepare yourselves for a grand adventure on what surely has to be the single biggest island in the entire world, but not before we wrap up the events of Egghead Island, which has been my favorite weekly reading experience since I caught up to the series in 2000, and I won't mention the exact year. It's very low, and don't want to mention it because I'm very old. But before getting to that, we need to start with this cover story, because it is heartwarmingly simple, and I think a lot of its meaning will get lost amongst the craziness of the rest of the chapter. But essentially, Denji Denjiro's solution to the problem with all of the kids hating all of the Yamatos is to sit them down and eat a delicious pot of Odin, which is beyond perfect. Our first introduction to Kozuki Odin was a man eating a pot of Odin on the charred remains of another man named Katsuzo, which is one of the more shocking introductions in One Piece, but Odin was doing this as their way of sharing one last meal and drink together, and thus honoring his relationship with Katsuzo. And obviously Odin's story is then bookended by him being boiled in a giant pot of oil, something he agreed to in order to keep his vassals safe and ensure that Wano would one day be free. On Wano, Odin is the meal of friendship. In the same sort of way that around the rest of the world, sake is the drink of fellowship. Luffy, Sabo, and Ace used sake to become brothers, and now Denjiro is using Odin to slowly and deliciously bridge the gap between the people of Wano and the child of Kaido. And also, to Yamato's credit, this is a very solid step in following in the footsteps of Odin, because he was the one who started using the meal for this purpose. If indeed Yamato still wants to do that, it's a bit unclear exactly where the whole wanting to be Odin thing is right now, but if we are following in the Odin story, then Yamato's probably gonna have a big, and I mean like mountain pig scale problem to solve very soon. But heading into the actual chapter and picking up right where we left off, Joy Boy's haki has done even more of the damage than previously suspected, because now it looks like even vice admirals are falling victim as the result of this mighty knot. And this does make me wonder about haki in general, because it's very, conveniently affected all of the Marines, but none of the Giants or the Straw Hats. All the people we don't like, they're down. All the people we do like, still standing. And if it's knocking out vice admirals, then it really should be taking out a fair few allies as well, if not most of them. And usually I would say that haki is somewhat controllable by the user. Shanks and Silver's Rayleigh have both shown us that haki can be used very precisely, even on a wide scale. But in this case, there was no one actually there to control the haki. So I guess Joy Boy was just on a whole different level, able to pre-program some sort of future ally insulation. And we do see Dory say that this haki might be even greater than that of the Shanks, which isn't surprising because Joy Boy did claim that this was the greatest haki, but it does seriously hype up Shanks even more. To think that he can even be compared to this level, which is a display of power that we haven't even come close to seeing from Luffy yet. So contrary to Luffy's words, on Wano, we're not quite at the peak yet. Of anything, really. I mean, if you're Dragon, then we're not even thinking about the peak. We still need to get him off the easterly facing toilet and into base camp. Very disappointing for a One Piece Dragon. But Egghead is all but over now, we're sailing away. But I think it's very fitting that this arc ended with a flashback of events that occurred long before this arc even began. Because time has been one of the most enduring themes of Egghead. The whole idea of we land on a future island and yet we focus almost completely on the past. In fact, the past is what we're actively striving for going forward. So it's very fitting that our final moments here are once again exploring the past and how it connects to all of the events we've just read. It's like a microscopic examination of One Piece as a whole. We start this grand adventure plowing forward into the future, and it's eventually going to end by taking us right back to the past. And I'll have a lot more to say about that shortly, because I actually think that this whole 2-week void is a very small-scale reenactment of the Void Century and gives us a lot of clues as to what happened. But first, during this flashback, our trio of Sherlocks discover that, gasp, there is a traitor. And I'm a bit surprised that they instantly jumped to accusing Lilith because, yeah, sure, aspect of evil and everything. But in my opinion, both violence and greed shouldn't have been quite off the table. But I think that Lilith not being the culprit actually contributed to Vegapunk's viewpoints during his message, where he refused to take a stance on who is good and who is evil in this enduring historical conflict, because he had just had a situation where he made that judgment and he was wrong. The evil Vegapunk that he thought was most likely to betray him was actually one of the most loyal. So this whole good and evil business is not as simple as it seems. And this is especially poignant because Lilith is the innate evil that exists within Vegapunk himself. So if Vegapunk can't even make the correct value judgment on himself, then what right does he have to declare with any certainty who the good and evil entities are in this conflict? Especially because, again, it's just not that simple. Yes, the world government, pretty bad, but not all of the world government, some pretty good. You do have this next generation of Kobe-esque Marines, and even that legendary generation of Garp, and with that in mind, it might not be the best idea to point a finger in the general direction of the world government and turn the entire planet against everyone in the organization, because they need to play out their roles unhindered every bit as much as Luffy does. But I do still think it's rather unbecoming of the smartest man in the world to not at any stage even consider the thought that, what if the greedy person is being real greedy? Or what if the violent person is working with the world government to enact more amazing violence? But in the end, Vegapunk did everything he could to preserve Lilith's life. And in fact, he has now trusted the future of his dream, and likely the future of the world, to the aspect of evil. So again, he is in no position to be making flat judgments about good and evil. Dr. First Name Unknown Vegapunk is a complex figure, and I think that his words and motivations are going to be studied incredibly thoroughly by fictional pirate scholars right up until the final chapter of the series and probably beyond. But just for right now, in 2024, let's get things straight here. Vegapunk knew that he was going to die, but then he wiped his memories and he didn't know that he was going to die. But then he found a message from himself that said, "Mate, you should strongly consider dying." And then another thing happened. This time, one thing that the smartest man in the world could not predict, which was the Straw Hat showing up on Egghead Island. So I wonder if there was ever a point where Vegapunk felt maybe just a tiny jolt of hope. And I wonder what would have happened if the world government had been even slightly delayed and the Straw Hats were allowed to escape. Would Vegapunk still have stayed behind and died like he told himself to? I'm not so sure, but maybe. And a pretty surprisingly integral character in this chapter, and in fact this arc, turned out to be Sanji, who is the only Straw Hat that Vegapunk confided his death wish in. Which, if I was Sanji, I would take as a pretty high compliment. Vegapunk sees Sanji and he goes, he's an odd fellow, but he seems a good ham. And also he's strong, too strong. He's so strong, he's probably going to end up saving my life, and I need to tell him in advance to do not that. And I guess in a way this kind of absolves Sanji, because he was copping a lot of flack for letting Vegapunk die, which he didn't do, but usually if someone was in this situation, they'd go on to blame themselves for not being as strong, fast, smart, or even a good cook enough to save the person who was just killed. But as much as he's struggling with it, I do think that Sanji accepts that this was all part of the plan, and there was really nothing he could have done to stop it. But that moment at the end of the chapter is everything. I love that Vegapunk confided in Sanji that he hopes that the Straw Hats will be the ones to claim the One Piece. Because that's a side of Vegapunk that the world didn't get to see in his message, which was mostly filled with very objective scientists presenting the facts and not coming to any conclusions unless the evidence was 100% certain. Because in addition to time, the other key motif on Egghead Island has been that of faith. And there's been a lot of really interesting moments of science and faith being integrated. We have quite a literal example of that in probably the most pious man in the One Piece world being turned into a super futuristic cyborgo. And I would like to believe that Kuma's faith was passed on to Vegapunk, and that led Vegapunk to seeing something beyond science that many years later would result in him placing his full faith in Luffy. Because you got to ask the question, why Luffy? Vegapunk doesn't have the luxury of knowing that he's the main character, and there's really no objective evidence that he's the right person for the job. All Luffy is one big vibe check. Sure, he evokes the imagery of the sun god Nika, but that is not science. That is art, and art is painfully fickle. And even when the Straw Hats arrived on Egghead Island, Vegapunk saw this as an act of fate, a greater force intervening. And again, this is also something that Sanji is now reckoning with on a much smaller scale, not quite certain of what he did, but also unable to deny its results. And the way I describe this is a sense of unclear justice, because it's not just Sanji who's leaving Egghead conflicted. I have to say that this chapter does recontextualize Kizaru's actions, whether he carried them out purely on behalf of the world government, or because he somehow understood Vegapunk's final desire. Doesn't really matter which one it is, kind of irrelevant, because that lack of clarity did end up producing justice this day, which is Kizaru's whole thing, unclear justice. And as always, this may, and it's probably just me coping in regards to my favorite sparkling Admiral man, but he may not be as irredeemable as initially thought. After seeing him kill Vegapunk, his story has been framed as one of tragic obedience. But what if the real story is one of tragic disobedience? Dying is what Vegapunk, want might be a strong word, but it's what he needed to do. And so I think it's actually very depressingly fitting that he did so via the hand of an old friend, a helping hand perhaps. Kizaru definitely didn't want to kill Vegapunk. His current anguish on the floor tells us that much. And actually, you know what? Was Kizaru knocked out by Joy Boy's Haki as well? It's hard to tell because he was already on the floor and lost his will to live prior to all of that happening. But is there perhaps a teeny tiny slight chance that Kizaru knew that Vegapunk's end goal was to die? And what he was actually fighting against internally was the desire to spare his friend's life. But instead, he ultimately chose to facilitate the last wish of Vegapunk. Again, this is probably mostly cope, but it would be a very One Piece thing to do. To present us with a horrific action, bad man, bad, and then emotionally justify it, give us a reason for it, and make us go, oh, good man, good. Again, it would definitely fit Kizaru's motto of unclear justice, because in his own way, he did stumble onto an act of justice through a very unclear and unconventional path. And right now, Kizaru is probably lying on the floor, still not quite sure about what he's done, but still somehow knowing that it was the thing that needed to be done, no matter what what path it took to get there. Or not, maybe he's just a broken cog of middle management existing in a depressingly outdated system. Switching gears now, it's definitely not lost on me that Vegapunk's 2-week void is a small-scale metaphor for the much larger Void Century, especially with the message he left himself. Because Vegapunk waking up to find that is very much like the Roger Pirate stumbling on Laugh-Tale, seeing the message from Joy Boy, and knowing exactly what to do from there. They didn't live through the Void Century, so they obviously have no memory of it, but they trusted what they discovered. Especially when it came to Roger, there was this definite sense of trusting in the power of death, which is why Roger then went on to make sure it happened in the most spectacular way possible. And that's exactly what Vegapunk did as well. He decided to trust what he found, and then he enacted the single most world-changing 10 minutes since Roger's execution. Consider it like this. If Roger was the person to kickstart the race for the One Piece, then Vegapunk is the person signaling the race's end. We're here now. Someone's gonna get it ridiculously soon, so prepare for changes. And I can't help but wonder if Vegapunk's words here reflect the Void Century as well. The fact that he used the incoming disaster to assure his victory. He knew that he was going to die, so he used that fact to do infinitely more damage to the world government than he ever could have done with the remainder of his life. And maybe Joy Boy was in a similar, albeit much more grand scenario, where he saw that their efforts were going to fail. It was a 100% guarantee. The Ancient Kingdom was going to be defeated, and so he switched focus to setting up a series of events that would culminate in their eventual victory that could only be triggered by his death. Or even a huge crack theory that Joy Boy's intention was to erase history for a period, much like Vegapunk did, although I think that idea might be going a bit too far, but maybe. I do like the idea that Joy Boy has already prepared for whatever is going to destroy the world government, and whoever finds the One Piece just needs to believe in that. The full story, it's not important, just do the thing. Which I think is a perfect answer for someone like Luffy. Obviously, we as readers, we demand to know as much about Joy Boy and the Void Century as possible, but Luffy has never really been the type to care about people's history. He doesn't care for the full story. He cares about right here and now, and he makes a personality judgment, then puts 100% trust in his choice. Which is why he walked away from Nojiko when she was explaining Nami's backstory. Luffy didn't need to know. There is nothing that Nojiko could have told him that would change his mind, and honestly, nothing she could have told him that he didn't already know intuitively. So I can very much see Luffy being told exactly what to do by the lingering will of Joy Boy, and he goes, yeah, it sounds like a nice guy, I'ma do it. But now, we've known that this has been coming for a while, but it still feels so surreal at the moment, because we are probably a mere handful of chapters away from finally landing on Elbaph. Other than Laugh-Tale itself, this is the single most hyped up island and arc in the series, and my hopes for Usopp are pretty damn high, given that he had one of the final lines of the chapter. And it's a pretty big deal, because usually in this situation, it is Luffy who proudly declares that they are setting sail to X destination. You know, with the classic captain's yell, and then in the anime it'll do something like pan up to the sky. But in his current, wrinkly, pruny state, Usopp was the one who had to give that classic destination yell. And now I know that I had some, I suppose, misguided hopes for Egghead Island being Frankie's arc, or not his arc, but at least make him a big part of it, given how at home a cyborg engineer should feel on a future island. I'm going to take the L there, obviously, and we're going to deal with the consequences of the Frankie bingo in a future video, don't you worry. But I think Oda is making it clear that Elbaph is going to be a big deal for Usopp. And look, I don't know, just throwing this out there, it could very well be the case that Usopp goes on to become the first Straw Hat to achieve his dream. That he does something worthy of being accepted within the Island of Warriors, and thus becomes a brave warrior himself. And I also have to mention that seeing him reunite with Dory and Broggy was even better than when Luffy re-encountered them. But also Chopper. I think I've mentioned this before, but Chopper has never met Dory or Broggy, which is really trippy because their arcs are back to back, and so I often associate all of Alabasta together as one big ball. But obviously, we're probably not heading to Elbaph straight away. In fact, we're probably on track to begin my favorite kind of One Piece chapters, which are the in-between global catch-up chapters. I say probably on track because we do currently know where most of the world stands. Egghead has done such a perfect job of casting a very wide story net, but the sort of thing I'm now expecting to see are major players across the planet doing exactly what Shanks did at the end of Wano and declaring that it's now time for them to go after the One Piece. I have a feeling we're going to get a David and Goliath situation with Usopp and another giant in Elbaph, perhaps low-key. We know giants settle disputes through battle, and Usopp standing up to a giant would be a great way to move him one step closer to his dream. I agree wholeheartedly, and this is exactly the sort of thing I'm hoping for. Because Usopp is perfectly set up for that David role right down to the slingshot, although the only way I can currently imagine it happening is if there's some sort of cultural dispute happening on Elbaph right now, because for Usopp to stand up to a giant, then that giant giant would need to insult Usopp's values, which at the moment happen to be tied to the values of the Elbaph warriors, which is why we're all currently looking in the general direction of Loki, because we have yet to explore the giant royalty at all. All we know about are the warrior class citizens on Elbaph, but there is assumedly an entire monarchy sitting up there on their big old tree, and they might not necessarily have the same values as the warriors down below. As time has gone on, they may have lost their way and leaned more towards the world noble end of the spectrum, likely with some nasty interference of course, because Kingdom Arcs in One Piece almost never involved the rightful royals being the bad guys. Although the one example I can think of where this isn't the case was Drum Island with Walpole, he was definitely the bad guy, but in every other kingdom situation, think Alabasta, Fishman Island, Dressrosa, Wano, it's always a force outside that has infiltrated to twist people against the current rulers. The gag with Vegapunk going "what" over and over was hysterical. So I think that one panel of Vegapunk reacting to all of the news perfectly encapsulated the weekly reading experience of Egghead Island. Because from the audience perspective, it's like, what? Vegapunk's on the island? What? Now Rablucci's here? Oh mate, now Kizaru's here? What is happening? And Elder Star is here? Now 5 old men are here and we're fighting against them with 2 sun gods and a robot? It's been non-stop madness, and Elbaph has a lot of work to do to even reach this level, let alone do better than that level. That's the word I'm looking for. Top it? Yeah. My favorite part of the chapter was the line where Shaka says, "What constitutes death for someone like us?" So this line was said whilst Vegapunk, Shaka, and Pythagoras were standing in front of Punk Records, which is very intentional because that big old brain contains the memories of all 7 Vegapunks. And what's that famous line about memories in One Piece? When does a man die? When he is forgotten. So in this case, not only are these 3 people, not dead because other people remember that they were alive, but actually because their memories do live on in another vessel, the big head, but also Lilith. And I guess also York. Lilith, York, and the head have the shared experience of all 3 of them. And this also juxtaposes very strongly against Kuma's situation where his body lived on, but his memories were removed. And the whole discussion about how losing one's memories is effectively killing the person who was formed by those memories, even if the technical definition of life is still active. And now Kuma has much the same bittersweet advantage that the Vegapunks do, because Bonnie now has all of his memories, and so his entire being now lives on within her, and in a much more powerful way than your standard remembrance. What's also interesting is the device the Vegapunks used to wipe their memories was different to the one that was used on Kuma. So I wonder if the Kuma memory wiping device was an older model that got refined over the years, or, and I wouldn't rule this out, if Vegapunk just has multiple memory wiping devices just lying around all of his labs. I should add that One Piece also has that very enduring theme of using the end as a beginning. Take Logtown for example, the town of beginnings and endings, which is where our story began with Roger's execution, which was his end, but the beginning of our great age of piracy. And almost every time we reach one of these endings, it results in a new beginning. Whitebeard dying during the Paramount War was signaling the end of his era as well as the end of our pre-time skip, but the beginning of a new era and our post-time skip. And it's especially true with Vegapunk because his end signifies the beginning of our end. This is the final push to the One Piece. Internet stranger, we must congratulate Nico Robin on becoming the 3-time world champion of surviving a Buster Call. That's very true. This whole time I have been preemptively calling her the world record holder for amount of Buster Calls. However, it's only now that she's officially earned that title after having survived her 3rd Buster Call. But also, Robin aside, something very special has happened on Egghead, because it may very well be the first island to survive a Buster Call, because there's a lot of destruction, but a whole ton of the island is still intact, and the Buster Call itself was defeated. It was stopped. So we're entering an era where the pressing of the golden snail is no longer a guaranteed signal of doom. But unfortunately, the world government now have a much more better weapon to fill that gap. So we are leaving Egghead with the Mother Flame and Punk Records in the world government's hands. Can't say this is the end of the arc. Too many things are unattended. There could be another chapter or 2 of wrap up, but this is feeling pretty final to me. And I do think that yes, we're leaving Punk Records and the Mother Flame with the world government, which is bad, but what else can we do? However, our saving grace is what Vegapunk said in this chapter, that the Mother Flame still has yet to be perfected, and until York can manage to do that, if she can manage to do that, not all is lost. Are we not gonna mention how S-Snake and probably the rest of the Seraphim stayed on the island and were not affected by the Haki? So S-Snake was unaffected, which is curious. I mean, firstly, I think the answer is bubbles. There's always bubbles. If the bubble tech is powerful enough to contain a seraphim, then I would bet, a frankly uncomfortable quantity of cash monies, that they're also powerful enough to insulate the seraphim from a burst of even the most potent of Conqueror's haki. Alternatively, remember that Dory said that this haki didn't seem hostile. It was pretty chill to them. It was much less chill to all the Marines, but it seems that this ancient haki can distinguish allies from enemies. So maybe the burst of haki just considered Esnik an ally. Because other than killing Pythagoras, she has been a pretty solid ally, even under York's command because of her thing for Luffy. Internet man, who do you think is the MVP of this arc? That's a tough question. I mean, it's gotta be Luffy, right? There was a point where this rubber dude was holding off both Kizaru and Saint Saturn all on his own, and everything we accomplished here was only possible because he is such a beast. But then again, you could also make the argument for Vegapunk being the MVP because his plan had the biggest overall effect. And if we're counting flashbacks, I do think there's a strong case for Kuma as well. He's definitely the emotional MVP of the arc at the very least. I have a feeling that Lilith is going to join Neomans. Ooh, alright. If she and Stussy were to join Neomans, then it would really become worthy of its name, because we now have two incarnations of two of the original members. And to be honest, it's not hard to see Lilith getting along with Caesar and Judge, particularly Caesar, who she can definitely bond with over the struggle for research funds. Also thinking about it, the whole idea of Vegapunk being in a group like this to begin with is, I think, a solid demonstration of the bit of evil that did exist within him, because he was facilitating all of these questionable minds. So I do think that Lilith would feel quite at home. And when it comes down to it, it may actually fall to Neomans to make Vegapunk's dream come true, which is difficult to conceive of at the moment because Caesar and Judge are such despicable beings. But if we can get the gang back together, then this is a group that could even surpass Vegapunk and his satellites. Is Egghead the only post-time skip arc without a feast? Not the only one, but it's one of the very rare ones. Whole Cake Island also ended without a feast because the crew were in a very similar situation where they had to retreat ASAP. Although I guess, depending on your perspective, it did end with a feast, at least for Big Mom, who got to nom nom on some colossal cakey. Also, I think that Egghead is ending with a feast because the Giants do have that onboard chef who was told to prepare an ungodly quantity of food. So I think that the feast may actually be taking place right now on the way to Elbaph. In the French translation, it's clearly said that Joy Boy's haki is superior to Shanks's. Not maybe. Well, tant mieux pour les Français. Obviously, Joy Boy's haki is stronger. I don't think that was ever in question, but I still maintain that Dory using Shanks as the next nearest comparison is still hype as crap. Found that this chapter was a disappointment. Already thought we were going to Elbaph, and it's just a mini recap of the previous chapters. Alright, so I can sort of understand this feeling, because this sort of chapter isn't what One Piece is best at, which is usually a bombardment of new information and questions with each installment. However, there comes a time where eventually those questions have to be answered, and this is that time. We're at the end of the arc. I do want to stress that this chapter isn't a recap though, it's more of a wrap-up that fills important gaps. And if we didn't have this chapter, then there would be a whole ton of people complaining that Oda never answered how or why, or maybe even some other question words, about Vegapunk making this message in the first place, and why did Shaka know that he was going to die, and all the stuff like that. There's a lot of little things like that that would be incomplete and unsatisfying without this chapter. But I also think it provides something new and very important, which is that we now know that Vegapunk is the one who actively made the choice to die. It gives him a lot of power and agency, as opposed to this being a tragic event that not even the smartest person in the world could find a way out of. In fact, it completely flips that script because, as it turns out, the world government played perfectly into the hands of the world's smartest man, and thus making him worthy of that title to the very end. They couldn't overcome him because of their inferior brain matter. And as I talked about in the last video, I do think that we're going to appreciate this 2-week void a lot more in retrospect. Once we know the truth of the Void Century, I think that we're going to look back at these 2 weeks of events and see a lot of similarities and a lot of hints that Oda left for us in this moment. We still don't know who helped Luffy to teleport. Yeah, it's true. We still don't know both who teleported him and who gave him the food, assuming they're the same person. Which would kind of annoy me if this was indeed the end of the arc, because that is too big and too random of an event to leave unanswered. My prediction would be that this question, like many in this chapter, gets wrapped up by a short flashback around now. Say, for example, if the Kizaru Uber Eats theory turned out to be true, then we see him sailing away from Egghead and briefly reflecting on that one glint of good he provided. I'm gonna say this in advance though, we need this answered in the actual series. I say we, I guess I don't speak for you. I need this answered in the actual series. If Oda answers this question in an SBS or something, then I think that would just be very lazy writing. But we're not at that point of accusation quite yet. And look, if you subscribe to Noodle Theory, there is a potential hint as to who could have fed Luffy, as one of the main sources of Kizaru speculation is that we saw Mr. Sparkle Admiral eating a bowl of ramen right before the assault on on Egghead, and that exact same style of bowl appears near Luffy when he's suddenly eating all the food. It might mean nothing. This might just be how Oda draws any standard ramen bowl in One Piece. But no matter what, I can say for a fact that it is indeed a thing. Don't let Sangi under a lady giant. I'll do my best. I just realized Dory mentioned in Little Garden that there was another man who left without setting the log pose. I think that might be Roger's crew, and that's how they know Shanks. So this is a lesser known One Piece misconception. The whole problem with landing on Little Garden is that it took the log pose a year to reset for travelers to get onwards to the next island. And in the anime, Dory suggested that the Straw Hats could just set sail without paying any attention to the log pose and see where they ended up, adding that a certain someone they'd met long ago did exactly that. The implication being, well, actually, I don't know what the anime were thinking at the time. There was so little context available, but I guess in retrospect, the implication is that it was Roger or Shanks. But it doesn't really matter because this line was anime only. In the manga, Dory never mentions this person. Although I guess what we have here is a very unusual situation of filler content going on to become canon. I mean, it wasn't filler. It was just a strange one-liner they threw in there. But we do know that Shanks must have been on Little Garden at some point to have met Dory and Broggy, so it would be a pretty ballsy Shanks maneuver to not wait on Little Garden for a whole year before moving on and just YOLOing his way back into the Grand Line. But I can see it happening. Why did Vegapunk wait after knowing about York's betrayal? Why not tell the world immediately if he knows he is doomed? So that, I think, is a pretty fair question, but I have an even more bigger question. And I've brought this up a lot, but when we first met Stella, he was phasing into Emmett, which which I assumed was the moment that he was placing the Denden Mushi. However, by this point, we know that he'd had his memories erased and he didn't even know his own plan, so he probably wasn't doing that. And in the Void flashback, we see the three Vegapunks talking about how no one will suspect where the hidden Denden Mushi is, so I guess this is when it was placed? In which case, just what was Stella doing when we first met him phasing into Emmett? Like checking out of curiosity or what? I'm not going to like Elbaph unless Oda puts in Vicky the Viking references, because him liking the show as well is the only reason I got into One Piece. So this comment is a bit of a deep cut. It's referencing the fact that one of Oda's primary inspirations behind One Piece was Vicky the Viking, which was a cartoon created in collaboration between Germany and Japan, and it really popped off in Japan in particular. And there is already a Vicky the Viking reference in One Piece. The child who we saw on Elbaph is modeled directly after the titular Vicky, so with that in mind, I would be expecting many more references as we go on to explore Elbaph. Just a reminder, Saint Saturn is still on the island as we speak. What will he do? His absence in this chapter was definitely felt. The last time we saw him, he was standing surprisingly comfortably in front of the crumbling Emmett, and as he and it stands, Saturn might be the only conscious person remaining on the side of the world government, which potentially puts Saturn in quite a bit of peril. Because he's now on the island, effectively on his own because everyone else is off having a lovely nap, which presents us with a very convenient situation to quietly take him out of the picture so that he can be impersonated later on. Personally, I really want to find a way to remove him at this point, because I can't shake the feeling that if we keep him in the story, he's just going to become another Jack. A villain whose narrative purpose was perfectly served and explored, and now we're just keeping him around so that he can eventually lose a fight later on. And the fact that all the Marines, and I mean all the Marines, are now unconscious, does also give Stussy a good opportunity to escape. I imagine she wasn't targeted by this surprisingly discriminatory Haki since she's an ally, and it might be interesting to see if the Haki targeted Kaku and Rob Lucci as well. What does the mighty Joy Boy consider the two of them? Because right now, I think they kind of sit in the middle. Rob Lucci maybe a little less than middle. Kaku maybe a little more than middle. I'm surprised Kuma is still with the Straw Hats and somewhat intact. A few chapters ago, we all thought he would make a big sacrifice for Bonnie. Well, we were right about a big robot guy making a sacrifice so that everyone can escape. We were just wrong about which big robot guy it would be. And I am glad that Kuma is still, well, intact might be generous wording, but mostly not destroyed, and that Bonnie is getting to have this moment of peaceful reunion with him. While everyone else is celebrating, she's just adorably huddling up in the corpse, of her father. And it's all just very depressingly sweet. And it is one reason why I do think that Egghead might still have just a little bit of kick to it, because a large part of this arc has been Kuma's story, and I do think that needs a solid full stop. Which means that the pain of Bartholomew Kuma may not have ended for us just yet, because I could see a Going Merry style Viking funeral for Kuma, just to get all of those tears out one last time, so that we're able to fully move on to our next adventure. The biggest reveal in One Piece is about to happen. I say the biggest, I mean one of the biggest, or at least definitely a reveal on the literal biggest island, because a mystery man is waiting for our straw hats on that there Elbaph, but he is not the only one. But before we get into Big Man, we have Big Bird. I always love checking in with Big News Morgans because he often reflects the readers. Right now, he's going insane, taking in all of the events that have just happened, just like we are. And we're all debating amongst ourselves how everything on Egghead's going to affect the world at large. The difference is that Big News Morgans has this practically godlike power to actually control the narrative of this planet, and therefore this story. And we hear that he's planning on breaking the news of Law versus Blackbeard and Eustace Kid versus Shanks, which on the one hand is expected. It is of course the job of Big Birdman to report on the Big Bird events, but it does make me very curious, as thinking about it, both of those battles took place in near complete isolation. In the case of Law versus Blackbeard, no one from the public were around to witness the event, and in the case of Shanks versus Kid, yeah, there were gazillions of people, but they were all Elbaph natives or part of Shanks' fleet. So I wonder if Morgans may have a spy and or spies plural planted into both the red hair and the Blackbeard pirate so that he is always the first bird to get a sweet scoop of bird feed in these obscure situations. And then, as expected, it's about to happen, Morgans is going to turn this entire world against Luffy by publishing that he is the one who killed Dr. Vegapunk. I've been fearing this outcome for quite some time now. We knew that Morgans wasn't going to turn Luffy into a hero ever since the moment he decided to report on the siege, where he painted Luffy as the clear villain. So in order to follow the plot he set up, he needs to do this as well. And this is a perfect example of the unchecked power Big News Morgans has. Because now anyone who doesn't personally know Luffy is going to assume that he is the most evil being in the world who must be stopped at all of the costs, which is probably going to heavily increase support for the Marines and the world government in their pursuit to find the One Piece before he does, because we can't have the bad man doing it. If the bad man finds a thing, then he's going to do bad things. Whereas consider this, if Big News Morgans had decided to say nothing, then all of the pressure would be on the world government right now, because we need answers. What was that message, world government people? Give us answers about the histories and such. But there's no time to be thinking about history when a doomed future is imminent, because Emperor of the Sea, Straw Hat Luffy, has beaten a Marine Admiral, killed Dr. Vegapunk, escaped a Buster Call, and is now potentially mere weeks or even days away from finding the One Piece and plunging everyone and everything into eternal darkness. From the perspective of newspaper readers, Luffy is on the cusp of becoming the next Rocksteady Zebek, a global terrorist who will not rest until he's destroyed all of your buildings, eaten all of your children, and slept with all of your wives. That is the fear that this planet now faces, all thanks to a bird. And I don't usually get chills when I think of Morgans because traditionally he's more so kind of on our side, but when he said that he doesn't care if the world sinks, that painted a horrifying future in my head, where for the sake of an exciting story, Morgans commits his power to ensuring that the world government actually succeed in flooding what's left of existence. An apocalypse is a pretty exciting event after all, and he'd do it as well. He will end existence for the sake of selling a 100 berry newspaper, which is, by the way, an insanely cheap price considering the cost of everything else in the One Piece world. And then we have poor rotund Sentomaru. I'm very happy to see him alive and I guess relatively well, but Sentomaru sailing away from Egghead Island is the saddest solo boat journey I've seen since Child Robin sailed away from Ohara. And the big question for Sentomaru now is, where exactly does he go from here? Uncharacteristically, we know a lot more about this region of the planet than most, because the Egghead arc has been pretty precise with all of its surrounding locations, and if you're setting sail from Egghead, there aren't many options, one of which is a marine base, which probably not a good idea after all of your betrayal, Sentomaru, but one very fun option might be for Sentomaru to find his way to Wano. He'd probably fit right in, he already has that very ye olde Japanese vibe happening, and it could be a good vehicle for a cover story centered on him, like how when we followed Capone Gang Beige and he backtracked to Dressrosa. That was fun. But what are his other options right now? I guess he could come to Elbaph with us, just, much slower. Well, there's Winter Island, which I don't remember anything at all. Is there anything on Winter Island? Just a lot of very phallic-shaped rocks. But in a complete reversal of the previous situation where everyone was standing and Kizaru was on the floor, now we have everyone else on the floor whilst Kizaru is standing. Yet another mind-blowing twist that Oda throws at us on a weekly basis. Who's gonna be standing and who's gonna be lying down next week? I, man on the internet, cannot tell you. No one can predict these things. I have to say though, this chapter gave me exactly what I wanted from Kizaru, which is a solid statement on where he lands emotionally after all of the horrendous acts he's committed on this island in the name of justice. And he gets a full-on Oda cry panel with nose drippings and everything. something I never expected to see from Kizaru or in fact any admiral. They're always so stoic and firm of mind. And I do feel a bit bad because I have given Kizaru a lot of crap week to week during this arc, and he's become a bit of an Egghead meme on this channel. But knowing where he stands, I think it's going to be quite difficult to go back and reread this arc with the knowledge of how much he's struggling with this mission. This chapter has very much changed my view of him. Previously, my assessment was that he was a man who had been beaten down by the system. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he did it anyway because the system had eroded his will. All that was left was a walking function. But now I see him as a man who was pursuing justice in his own unclear way. He's not the unfeeling shell that I've characterized him as, and if anything, he is so driven by justice that he's had to violently break every moral barrier presented to him for the sake of making what is in his mind a better world. I see him more along the same lines as I see Sakazuki now, because what Kizaru did here is very absolute justice, but here is the key difference between them. The key difference is certainty. Sakazuki does horrible things, but he does so with the certainty that this is the correct path. Whether or not that's actually true in reality doesn't matter, it's certain in his head. Whereas Kizaru, he will commit those same acts hoping that it's the correct path, but not quite knowing for sure. Hence why it's unclear justice. The flashback with Vegapunk was short but fantastic, if only to see all of Kizaru's funky outfits across time. And look, if I didn't know any better, I'd say that Kizaru was far more interested in pursuing fashion than justice. But this chapter proves that very wrong. And it's not just that Vegapunk was his friend, apparently this relationship went beyond that. Kizaru calls Vegapunk his best friend, and I don't know how to feel about that. My first question would be if Vegapunk knows that Kizaru thinks about him this way, because I always got the impression that Vegapunk considered Kizaru more of a work colleague, someone to keep at arm's length. And it makes me want to know more about Kizaru because he feels like a very lonely man to me. The kind of guy who doesn't really have a lot of friends outside of work, although he does have a brother in Sakazuki, which was a surprisingly intimate bond revealed in this chapter, one that you first catch a glimpse of when Sakazuki calls Kizaru by his real name Borsalino instead of his admiral epithet. But we should examine this thoroughly because English is not good enough to convey the nuance of this conversation. I think most people watching this are probably familiar with the term Aniki, which translates as older brother, but it's not generally used to mean an actual biological brother. It's an honorable term that you use for someone that you consider a superior. For example, Johnny and Yosaku refer to Zoro as Aniki always, incessantly, it's all they say. However, that is not the word that Sakazuki uses here. The exact word that Sakazuki uses is kyodai, meaning sibling, and this can actually refer to biological siblings, but given Sakazuki's Yakuza theming, it's more likely that he's using it to describe a sworn brother, which is important because this implies a more balanced relationship. Like Luffy, Ace, and Sabo, they refer to each other as kyodai, a trio of sworn brothers. And with this dynamic, it's also interesting to linger on the fact that Kizaru is 3 years older than Sakazuki. So even though Sakazuki outranks him as the fleet admiral, there is a certain level of reverence that Sakazuki pays Kizaru as his elder, and I just find this scene fascinating because it offers such a rarely seen insight into Sakazuki's inner workings. He's not just a man willing to commit every crime ever invented and even invent some new creative original ones, all for the sake of justice. He's not just that. Sakazuki is a man of honor and he treats his bonds very seriously, which is something we also saw with Kuzan when he was explaining the Battle of Punk Hazard to Blackbeard. Kuzan spoke about how this fight genuinely pained Sakazuki because he considered Kuzan a close comrade. You know what really makes me think though? Sakazuki understands what Kizaru is saying. Kizaru asks Sakazuki if he's ever had to kill his best friend, and Sakazuki doesn't say no. In fact, he responds terrifyingly empathetically. Remember that this is Sakazuki, big angry lava man, and he generally does not respond to emotional pleas, like that guy at Marineford who deserted the battlefield because he was afraid for the future of his family. Sakazuki just up and killed him. There was no empathy there whatsoever, but here there is. It's almost like maybe Sakazuki has killed his best friend in the past, or at least an incredibly close comrade, or even a family member, because he immediately backs the F off and apologizes. And that in and of itself is huge, because this operation is one of the greatest failures that the Marines have ever endured, and Sakazuki is the one apologizing. Also, we need to talk about Saint Saturn, or the lack thereof, Saint Saturn, because he's now been absent for 2 whole chapters and potentially for the foreseeable future, because I don't know how much business we still have to deal with on Egghead. It feels like we're leaving it behind, and it looks like Oda is gearing up to toss us straight onto Elbaph. But mate, I need to know what happened to this old man. Catching up with the Straw Hats, we have a trio left on the Thousand Sunny whilst everyone else is with the Giants, and I love this combination. We have Zoro Zoro, Jinbei, and Frankie, and here's why these three were picked. Firstly, Jinbei is the helmsman, so he can't just up and abandon ship to party with some giants. But what I love is that this shows the trust that the crew and particularly Nami have in Jinbei, because otherwise I feel like she would need to remain on board to navigate. Frankie is also present because he's the ship technicianman and also part of a skeleton crew whose role can't easily be replaced. And then we have Zoro, who's staying with the Sunny in case someone really strong rocks up to fight battle, which is possible as far as they know. There's an entire marine fleet and 5 old monsters chasing them. But whilst waiting for the potential of that, Zoro has some words to say. This is a very Zoro thing to hold Luffy to his status, and it's something that we most notably saw when Usopp left the crew on Water 7. Zoro was firm but fair with Luffy about his role as a captain, and it's something we also saw on Punk Hazard when Zoro chastised Luffy about messing around in the New World. Zoro consistently holds Luffy to his status, in this case now being an Emperor of the Sea. And the more status Luffy gains, the more Zoro wants him to stop effing about. So what we have here in his mind is a life of one old dude set against one of the 4 most influential pirates in the world. What he's missing though is that in this case, Luffy made a promise. And no matter how big or small that promise was, failure is unacceptable. Luffy doesn't see his status in the same way that Zoro does, and from Luffy's perspective, saying things like, "I'll get you off this island alive, old man," and "I'm the man who's going to become the Pirate King," carry equal weight. And if he can't keep his word on the first statement, then it seriously jeopardizes faith in the latter. Which is why it is incredibly important that this chapter goes on to establish that Luffy did technically keep his word, because if he doesn't, then it undermines everything he's been working towards, and it triggers another Ace situation where Luffy begins to seriously doubt himself. But because that's not happening here, we've already done that long ago, Oda takes this opportunity to go for a joke that I love, where Chopper says that Luffy, he's so depressed that he's only managed to eat 5 bunches of giant grapes. It's so good. But in essence, all of the Vegapunks still live on within Lilith, and there's a part of the chapter where it looks like Lilith is being spoken to or processing the information that she wasn't conscious for, sort of like an update being installed. And I do wonder, now that she's the last surviving Vegapunk apart from York, let's not talk about York, traitorous vixen, I wonder if Lilith isn't just the aspect of evil anymore, and if she is quite literally hearing the voices of everyone else, thus truly becoming Vegapunk by combining every other aspect back into one vessel, all except for greed, which turned out to be the one key flaw in Vegapunk's personality. And so what we now have in Lilith could be a perfected Vegapunk, one that is now free of what little corrupting influence of greed there was within him, and a being truly capable of bringing Vegapunk's dreams into reality. And just like that, Egghead Island has a surprisingly happy ending for the Straw Hats. And we even get the customary crew toast, which I think is Jinbei's first official crew toast and the one we've been waiting for since Luffy put it on hold and then just never got back to it during Wano. So even though it's not strictly in Jinbei's honor, here it is, I guess. And during this part, there's a great moment with Chopper and Robin where she's squeezing the life out of him and saying that she might be able to see Saul, which is something that I'm very much looking forward to. But you've got Chopper there just like, "That's great, Robin, please stop squeezing me." And I have to wonder if Chopper has any idea who she's talking about, because do the Straw Hats actually know Robin's backstory and that sort of detail? Most of the flashbacks we see are told to the Straw Hats by someone else, but Robin's just sort of played out while everyone was standing on buildings. So I'd like to think that Chopper is just humoring Robin, hoping that she'll release her clutch of doom. But going back a bit, one of the very small big things that I really love about this section is seeing the full couch, and just how non-existent Lilith and the Straw Hats are sitting on it. I mean, they needed a huge ladder just to get up there. This is a taste of what's to come on Elbaph. Wano may have been our longest journey, but Elbaph is definitely going to be our biggest. Oda is going to go wild with scale in ways that he's never been able to do before, and I absolutely cannot wait for the artistic insanity that's going to ensue. And in true Oda fashion, we can't end a chapter on a break without some sort of cliffhanger, which is given to us in the form of an Elbaph silhouette. It would appear that someone is waiting for the crew to arrive, which makes sense because the giants were sent to go pick them up. And it's not Saul, at least I seriously doubt that it's Saul. And judging by the hat, I would say that hopes are quite high that this person could solve one of the most enduring mysteries in One Piece, which is exactly who the crap Crocus was talking to on the cover of chapter 631. The figure here is wearing a classic Wano Amigasa, which is why many of us thought that this figure was going to be from Wano, or at least reside on Wano and going to be revealed during that arc. But that didn't happen, and there really aren't many people left in this world that this could be. Given how friendly this figure was with Crocus, my first thought would be Scopa Gaban, because they were both on the same crew and everything thing. And I say this even though the hair color doesn't match, because that doesn't matter. Something to keep in mind is that the official digitally colored manga makes a lot of guesses with color schemes that are later confirmed to be different by Oda, like a hero from the Revolutionary Army who had quite a radical color shift recently. So I wouldn't take the blonde hair as an indicator of anything at this stage. But you let me know in the comments who you think this figure is, and we'll dive into the other insane possibilities in the next video. It's obviously Shanks. It's the exact same shaded sitting on a cliff drinking scene we had after Whole Cake Island. Alright, let's talk Shanks. A lot of people have been saying this name, and I don't think it's 100% out of the question for this silhouetted figure to be Shanks, but I do think it's very unlikely, and I think that for reasons. Firstly, in his favor, yes, this is a very classic Shanks pose, and the figure appears to be drinking a very classic Shanks drink, and very importantly, the figure is drinking with his right arm, which is the only one that Shanks still has, so that's very relevant to note. And I think the idea is that the thing that looks like a spherical hat is actually Shanks's insanely large collar. It's quite big, and this would be one of the better locations for Shanks to catch up with Luffy. It's assumedly friendly territory, and Luffy is now more or less equal to Shanks. He's a great pirate and such, so their agreement could be considered technically fulfilled, but I don't know if technically is good enough, because here's why I don't think this is happening. Throughout the short time we got on Elbaph with Shanks, he and his crew were repeatedly talking about how they were about to leave. Shanks hears the news that Eustace Kid has rocked up, and he says, oh, bad timing for him because we were about to set sail. Meaning that if Kid had been, even an hour later, then they wouldn't have clashed and the bad things wouldn't have happened to him. Shanks also referred to Elbaph as a pit stop when his Grand Fleet was surprised they were leaving so quickly. And so all indications point to Shanks being in a bit of a hurry to move to his next destination. So I don't think he's just casually chilling on Elbaph, considering all of the urgency we previously saw. And I also don't think that he would just wait for Luffy to rock up, because really the onus should be on Luffy to catch Shanks. That's what a truly great pirate would do. And right now Shanks is still one step ahead of Luffy. So for Luffy to be deserving of returning the Straw Hat, he needs to be on equal footing to Shanks, which he is currently not. He is a step behind. They are not equal. And one reason why Shanks may have this sense of urgency may have also been revealed in that same chapter. The doctor of the Red Hair Pirates reported that Blackbeard had just left Hachinosu, to which Shanks replied that he was sure Blackbeard was going to show up on Wano, and that's most likely why the Red Hair Pirates sailed past Wano, ready to intercept Blackbeard should he do whatever Shanks predicted he was going to do, which he didn't. So as is traditional with One Piece, Shanks is laser focused on Blackbeard, and he's trying to make a move to intercept Blackbeard's moves. It's like a complex game of pirate chess, except Blackbeard doesn't even realize he's playing. Blackbeard would appear to be fatesomely avoiding Shanks thanks to whatever blessing is granted to him by the almighty D. Although to Shanks' credit, there's a lot of reasons to assume that Blackbeard would strike Wano. One would be assuming that Blackbeard knows about Pluton. Blackbeard has also been gathering the mystery cubes, and Shanks probably knows that the ancient weapon is there from his time with Roger. But Blackbeard has also been gathering devil fruits, and it's a fairly reasonable idea that he would use this opportunity to target Kaido and acquire his dragon fruit, much like how he took the opportunity to take Whitebeard's powers during Marineford and tried to take Boa Hancock's abilities. Plus, it's also well known that Kaido had a road poneglyph, which Blackbeard would need and does now have thanks to his encounter with Law. So whether it be intentional, luck, or by fate, Shanks keeps getting outplayed by Blackbeard. What makes me excited though is the thought of why Shanks stopped at Elbaph, because he wasn't expecting to see Dory and Broggy there. That was a pleasant surprise. However, if Shanks did know the silhouetted figure and that person was, say, Scopa-Gaban, then this pit stop would make a ton of sense. Shanks has declared that it is time to claim the One Piece, so on his way to doing that, Shanks stops in on Elbaph to check in on his elderly crewmate. Shanks says, mate, the time has come, and Gaban wishes him all the best in fulfilling Roger's legacy. I should say that I'm not all in on Scopa-Gaban. It really could be any number of characters and even someone we have yet to meet. However, we are starting to run out of time for someone of Gaban's weight to enter the story and have a profound effect. So right now, I don't know, seems like a good opportunity, but what do I know? I'm just a man on the internet. And while we're here, a lot of people seem to currently believe that Elbaph is part of Shanks' territory, and that's why he was there, as it comes under the purview of his very Scarlet Empire. But I don't think that he would either want or dare to try and claim Elbaph. Elbaph. The island of proud warriors isn't simply going to submit, and they have no reason to. The world government can't mess with them, so they don't need the protection of an emperor in the same way that locations like Fishman Island did. Shanks also doesn't tend to recruit strong people, at least not for his extended forces. His grand fleet are composed of weaker individuals that he's protecting. Man on the internet, have you heard the theory that the man Crocus is talking to is Golden Lion Shiki? I sure have. I've been hearing it ever since that chapter cover first came out back in the ancient days. It's been a long time now. Shiki was suspect number one back in the day because he was one of the few characters who had a distinctly Japanese aesthetic. This is a bit difficult to comprehend now, but before Wano, there were not a lot of those. And when the official digitally colored manga came out, people lost their buttholes because the outfit and the color scheme did match Golden Lion Shiki almost perfectly, with the one logistical issue being that Shiki probably isn't capable of wearing hats due to the steering wheel lodged in his head, which can't ever be removed, or else he will be removed from life. And look, it's exciting and everything because you see the colors and you go, it's gotta be him. But my personal theory as to what happened here is a bit boring. And what I think is that whichever employee was charged with coloring this saw the outfit and thought, mate, that looks a little bit like Shiki, and so the figure was given his color scheme. I pointed this out in the last video as well, but you really cannot put too much, if any, stock in the official digital coloring. If it's not Oda's direct coloring, it's not canon. Because a lot of the time, the colors inevitably change. I used the example of a hero in the last video, but another great example is Prince Gru, who made his first appearance as a minor figure during Capone Gang Beij's cover story, but when it was time for Gru to actually get involved in the story, Oda's color scheme was entirely different from what the original color artist had chosen for him. And so I know a lot of people are still pointing to this Crocus figure as being the Shiki, and look, Shiki, he's a pretty important dude. Member of the Rocks Pirates and first publicly known person to escape Impel Down. There was technically someone before him, but no one knows about that. But I think that Shiki is done. Oda did plan to have him as a villain in the story at one point, but he was plonked into Strongworld instead, and I don't anticipate him ever returning outside of very minor references. Another idea I should mention, because this always comes up in relation to the Crocus figure, is the idea that he's talking to Calico Yorkie, the former captain of the Rumbar Pirates who, oh no, caught a fatal disease and then sailed off into the sunset. Due to the One Piece rule of never believing that a person is dead unless you see the body, there's always been a semi-popular idea that Yorkie was going to return at some point after fatefully discovering a cure for his disease. Much like what seemed to happen with Gin, he sailed off into the sunset and didn't die of the deadly poison he was poisoned with. Don't know how that happened, doesn't matter, Gin's cool. And that's why Crocus was being so friendly with him, not Gin, the Yorkie. Because finally a member of the Rumbar Pirates has returned for Laboon, but I also don't like this idea for two main reasons. One is that it would imply that Yorkie traveled all the way to Wano, or at the very least ran into someone from Wano who clothed him in the traditional garb of his or her people. And there's just a few too many dots to connect to make that seem plausible to me, at least currently. The other is that it would water down Brook's eventual reunion with Laboon because he's the one who made the promise to use his second life to fulfill their commitment to Amazing Whale. And because One Piece is a story, I think that he's the one who needs to meet Laboon first. I say first. The reality is that Brook is more than likely the only one still alive. But I don't know, maybe. Again, Gin came back, so maybe Yorkie's gonna come back as well. Speaking of Gin though, I have to say we've definitely entered a new era of silhouette theories because the first person that used to be suggested for every new mystery silhouette used to be Gin. However, now that he's had his glorious background cameo in Hachinosu, oddly enough he's getting even less attention than he used to when he was just gone from the story. That's the One Piece effect. We're always thinking about the characters that we can't see. If someone's not there, it means they must be doing something important. More important than what we're actually seeing. And if we can see them, then we know what they're doing. There's no mystery. They're unexciting. So unfortunately, after his resurgence into One Piece, it is now time to put Gin to rest. My headcanon is that Morgans has a very amicable relationship with the newsbirds as a Zoan, and that's how he always gets a great scoop, because he feeds them or something. It's definitely not uncommon for people with animal powers to be able to communicate with fellow animals. Chopper can speak to pretty much any creature on land or in the sky, whilst Jinbei can communicate with anything in the sea. However, at the same time, neither of these are the result of a devil fruit. It's always because of what they were sans magical fruit. Jinbei doesn't even have a magical fruit, he's just magical. But you have to think that Morgans does have some way of communicating with his army of Newsku, because otherwise, how are they going to do their jobs? These Newskus are the Amazon delivery drivers of his entire empire, so he's surely able to speak to them at the very least, although it's also implied that these birds are smarter than your average creatures, because Nami complained to one about the price of newspapers in chapter 96, and the news crew looked very apologetic about the whole situation, much like a poor retail worker dealing with a very volatile volatile Karen. And all of that is a very roundabout way of saying that a lot of these scoops obtained by Morgans could come from his network of birds, which are constantly flying all over the planet. There are very few places that his network cannot reach. I can't believe I felt bad for Kizaru when he was yelling at Sakazuki. He did absolutely nothing to help us, brackets maybe, but I was still cheering for him when he told Sakazuki to screw off. Again, this is just classic One Piece. You can thoroughly detest a character for any amount of time, days, weeks, years, decades, but if Oda wants to, he can flip that emotion in an instant and make you root for them. And that's one of the main reasons why I continue to believe that Sakazuki isn't going to turn out to be quite the monster we currently know him as. And I think that he'll have quite a rough past for us to contend with, not one that justifies his actions, but one that at least explains them and does evoke a shred of sympathy. As for Kizaru, someone else pointed this out to me in the comments, and I apologize because I cannot find the comment, but to whoever said this, it is a great point. Emmett/Joyboy's haki was very discriminatory and only targeted enemies, and I didn't think anything of this at first. I think I just subconsciously believed that Kizaru was the only marine powersome enough to withstand the blast. However, in an incredibly tragic turn, it could also be because the haki did not target him, as he was considered to be a genuine friend of Vegapunk. And that implication is especially heartbreaking. It's nowhere near confirmed that that's what happened, but look, it's possible. Kizaru asking Akainu if he ever killed his best friend has even more value if you consider that Akainu could not bring it to his heart to kill Aokiji. This is something I forgot to mention, and honestly, shame on me, man on the internet. You've got one job to talk about the fictional pirates, and you didn't say the thing. But this line does hit incredibly hard when you remember that Sakazuki did not have the backbone to kill Kuzan. After 10 days of vicious fight battling, Sakazuki had a moment of softness and neglected to do his duty, which has now resulted in Kuzan pledging himself to the Blackbeard pirates. So what Kizaru's saying here is such a cutting clapback. Sakazuki's all like, Kizaru, mate, can't believe you messed this one up, bruh. And Kizaru replies, yeah, well, why don't you tell me what it was like to kill your best friend? Oh, what's that? You didn't cause you pussed out? Yeah, that's what I thought. And then Sakazuki promptly apologizes. Which isn't to say that Kuzan and Sakazuki were best friends or even standard friends, or if the F word was ever mentioned around any one of them, because ever since Ohara, at the very least, Kuzan has always been thoroughly disgusted by Sakazuki. However, what they do share at the very least is the fellowship of a battlefield of justice. A part of me is still holding out hope that Edison wasn't off-screened and is actually hiding in Sentomaru's barrel. I can see him Tyrion Lannistering himself out of King's Landing, sure. And there's also a sack on the boat. But as intriguing as this idea is, I can't help but slit my own wrist with Occam's razor and say that the simplest and likely most correct answer is that we have a sack of food and a barrel of water for the long journey ahead. Sentomaru is a big boy, and big boys need to keep themselves full, so that he has the energy he needs to keep claiming that he has the world's best defense before promptly losing to everyone who puts that defense to the test. In regards to Edison potentially being alive, my feelings on this have changed over time, but right now I'm leaning that I hope not, just because of what happened in this chapter with Lilith. I really like the idea that all of the aspects now live on within her, and Lilith is now the next generation Stella. And so Edison actually being alive would, I think, undermine that a bit. If Robin doesn't do the soul laugh on Elbaph, then we riot. Alright, so I was thinking about this the other day. That laugh, it is so powerful, so iconic. And then I started to wonder, why have we never seen adult Robin do this laugh? But it's fairly obvious because Soul taught her that laugh to use in especially hard times, as his theory is that happiness brings laughter, and so the opposite must also be true. Laughter can bring happiness. And in the case of adult Robin, she hasn't really needed to resort to that laugh because most of her time has been spent being happy for real with the Straw Hats. And that brief unpleasant period of Watch 7 and Enies Lobby was spent with Robin actively denying herself happiness, so she wouldn't have done the laugh there either. Now, before someone mentions this in the comments, I should say that adult Robin has done the laugh at least once in the One Piece anime that I know of. When Black Maria created the illusion of Soul, Robin saw him and did the dedashishishi, which was actually adorable. But I agree, when this reunion happens, I want her and all of us to do the most heartiest of dedashishishis. It'd be cool to see Sentomaru end up on Wano, then meeting Wano via the cover story, then they come together as backup in the final war. Alright, so one reason why Sentomaru ending up on Wano is a pretty solid idea is because Sentomaru is also based on the tale of Momotaro. It's been a while since we've talked about this, but Momotaro literally means Peach Boy. Meanwhile, Sentomaru literally means Battle Peach Boy. and Momotaro was a huge inspiration for the entirety of Wano, particularly with the raid on Onigashima. Onigashima is a name ripped straight out of the folklore. Momotaro himself went to Onigashima himself with his allies, a monkey, a dog, and a pheasant, all of which Oda made sure were present during the raid in some form. The monkey is pretty obvious, the dog was Inuarashi, and the pheasant was Mako. So if Sentomaru is looking for a new home and a new person to protect, then I can't help but feel that Wano is a pretty natural destination. And then we might even be able to see the clash of two Peach boys, nay, Peach men. And in regards to the cover story, with a stomach full of Oden, Yamato is now traveling to Kuri, which is Oden's former daimyo territory, when, oh no, a misdeed is encountered. Someone attempted to kidnap a woman. And we do see that someone, but not a lot of that someone. And my guess is that it's either a former member of the Beast Pirates or a former Orochi loyalist, because here's the crazy thing about Wano. The Beast Pirates consisted of 20,000 members, and Orochi himself had a force of 10,000 samurai loyal to him. So for argument's sake, let's say that all 10,000 Orochi samurai all of a sudden become good, we like them, yeah? That still leaves a whopping 20,000 Beast Pirates somewhere on Wano. They didn't all just disappear, primarily because they can't. Due to Wano's isolated nature, they don't actually have anywhere else to go. You can't just send Tamaru in a boat your way out of this one. But to bring this full circle, if Yamato is going to perform a full Oden, then at some point, someone's gonna have to show up and play the role of Whitebeard to escort Yamato off the island and eventually deliver Yamato to Luffy, the Roger of this age. And maybe that man is Sentomaru, but also maybe none of that's gonna happen at all. I feel like I'm going crazy, because this man had like 3 other channels, lol. This man certainly does. And one of those channels is dedicated to Hunter x Hunter, which has just been announced as returning to Weekly Shonen Jump. So we've got new weekly chapters coming, and I've got a ton of Dark Continent and Succession War recap content, which you should absolutely check out over at New World Review, the link to which will be in the description. Big things are happening in the world of fictional old men. 1 dead, 2 dead Moonhead. The 5 elders have received a much needed upgrade in the form of Saint Vigilant Garling, and this has incredibly sinister implications for the future of One Piece, because the other 4 elders know something about Garling, something that makes them very uncomfortable. To be fair, I imagine that at this age, most things make them feel uncomfortable. But we actually begin this chapter with quite a touching moment as Kaku and Rob Lucci board a world government ship, and naturally, everyone's asking, where's Stussy? And Lucci's response is that she dead. I'm not sure if the implication is that Lucci's trying to say that he's the one who killed her. One of the early translations did have Lucci flat out saying, I killed her, so we'll see when the official comes out. And I don't know if Oda's intention here is to try and deceive the reader, because the last time we saw Kaku, he was warning Stussy about Lucci's fury, and he said that he wouldn't be able to stop him from attacking her. So putting that event together with this event, it is logical to assume that Lucci made good on Kaku's words, but I don't buy this for a second. It's been extremely subtle, but Lucci's character is definitely softened over the course of Egghead Island, and we have seen him make time for and prioritize his bonds. Like the brilliant moment when he asked Marcus Mars to spare Kaku's life. So here's what I think happened. Kaku told Lucci the truth, that Stussy released him from Bubble Prison because she considered him a friend, and Lucci, who also considers Kaku a friend, is either now covering for Stussy or much more likely covering for Kaku. Because if Lucci doesn't take responsibility for this event, then it all falls onto his giraffe friend, and Kaku may even be punished for allowing a known enemy to escape. Lucci doesn't want that, so he reports that Stussy is dead and he may have killed her. I guess it's also possible that Kaku may have lied to Lucci, but I don't see Lucci being particularly easy to deceive like that. Either way, I guess one or both of them is now just hoping that Stussy is smart enough to hide herself and lay low for a bit, which I think is a safe bet considering that she was both a CP0 agent and an Emperor of the Underworld, so she can be trusted to lay low and keep secrets. I feel like I say this every week and then it doesn't happen, but this does feel like the final chapter of Egghead Island. And now that I've said that, watch me be wrong again next week. But the one thing I still so desperately want to know as we wrap up all of this is what was the mission of Katarina Devon and Van Alger on Egghead Island? Apart from infringing on St. Saturn's copyright, what was their purpose? Because they were there before the Marines got there. They might not even have known that St. Saturn was going to be there. So I have questions that need answering from an enigmatic beard man, all of which are traditionally quite enigmatic in One Piece. St. J. Garcia Saturn has apparently been a very naughty boy, and not in the good kind of subjugation of the masses sort of naughty. During a mini flashback, it was revealed that Saturn was the one who gave the command to preserve Emmett after he attacked Pact Marijois 200 years ago. First thing about this flashback is that Saturn looks exactly the same. So whatever pact was made with Emu seems to have halted his aging, and there's no exactly telling how old Saturn was. Could be lots. I mean, it is lots, but how many lots? And we'll get to the stuff about Emu's powers in a bit because, mate, that was a horrific death. But firstly, I'd like to say that Emu's course of action in this chapter was extremely warranted because it was the whims of Saturn that caused absolutely everything that happened on Egghead Island. Whether it be his sapphire scale research that started the chain of events with Kuma and Bonnie that created two sun gods now, two joy people, or preserving Emmett just so that he could end up being the reason why the Straw Hats and a Vegapunk escaped. It's actually difficult to comprehend just how much of a colossal screw-up Saint Saturn is. His actions may very well be the catalyst for the dissolution of the entire world government. At the moment, there is no one more to blame than him, because if he had just followed orders and disposed of the robot, then Luffy and the Straw Hats would be flat out dead right now. Gear 5th is crazy powerful, but its limitations leave Luffy with these pockets of vulnerability, and if he was forced to keep fighting all of the elders and a Buster Call, then he would have eventually fallen, very potentially like the Joy Boy before him. So in a sickening twist of events, there is actually a solid argument to be made that Saint Saturn is our MVP of Egghead Island because none of this would have happened without him. I guess I never expected one of the 5 elders to disobey Emu, to let his ambition supersede his loyalty, but I don't know why I didn't expect that. These guys all quite literally refer to themselves as gods, and as much as they bow before Emu, they must all have tremendously inflated egos, and it makes me wonder what liberties the other 4 elders have taken during their time. But I have to say, I am so satisfied with the death of Saturn, because it is well deserved from every perspective. From the viewpoint of our protagonist, Saturn is one of the most putrid One Piece villains to have ever existed. He did horrific things to Ginny, Kuma, and Bonnie, and he more than deserves this, I guess we'll call it moral punishment. But then you switch to the viewpoint of Saturn's allies, and he cost them everything. No event in the last 800 years has undermined the world government's authority as much as the Egghead Island incident, and it was practically orchestrated by Saturn's hubris. So let's say that you're Emu, right? You need to set an example. Saturn was a man who lived for however many centuries, and he became far too comfortable in his position of power. So he took stupid risks, and we can't do that. We need to get our shit together. And I doubt that the other elders are going to be taking such risks after seeing this. Narratively, it's also perfect. I've spoken about this in previous videos, but I was dead set on the hope that Saint Saturn wasn't going to make it off Egghead Island because he has no role to play in the story going forward. His character was utilized to perfection during this arc, and if he stuck around, it would only be to waste space on pages fighting someone in the final saga, like how Jack's character was fully explored on Zou, but Oda carried him over to Wano, and he was mostly a waste of what little space he was given there. That's why this is a very conflicting chapter, because I'm extremely happy with one death, but kind of annoyed at the 3 to 4 fake-out deaths. We'll get to them. To conclude Saturn though, his death looks suitably painful. The dude shriveling and melting away to nothing but bones gives me the impression that what Emu did was actually quite simple, and perhaps it was something like releasing their connection or their pact, which then caused Saturn's real age to catch up with him. His body was no longer being artificially sustained, so it all just decomposed. It was quite visceral. And the reactions of the Vice Admirals were masterfully done. Oda gave all of them an expression of legitimate horror, which I praise because that's difficult to do when your characters look like Vice Admiral Red King, someone so cartoony that it's difficult not to laugh anytime he does anything. But even Red King hit me with a feeling of serious horror that was happening right in front of him. And you really have to wonder about these Vice Admirals. After having seen what happened to Saturn, surely they are starting to feel like maybe they're on the wrong side here. Which actually, before Saturn died, this point was brought up by Vice Admiral Doberman. Doberman is your classic One Piece Vice Admiral. We first met him during Enies Lobby, as he was one of the chosen 5 to lead that Buster Call, meaning that this is Doberman's second time commanding a Buster Call on an island involving Nico Robin. And of all people, he asked a very ballsy question in this chapter. Saturn referred to the primary failure being the inability to stop Vegapunk's message. And so Doberman asked, "Mate, Mr. Saturn, if we failed, does that mean that there was some truth to the old Appleman's message?" And it's like, bruh, you saw Saturn turn into a colossal spider monster, and you think it's a good idea to openly ask if he's the bad guy? So Doberman gets his head popped, although I think he'll be fine. Whether it be Haki or mercy from Saturn, his head didn't completely explode like that one poor Marine we saw. But these Vice Admirals, they've seen some stuff today. And I bet that most of them are questioning what exactly it is empires they're fighting for, especially since they all now know a very forbidden name because Saint Saturn, he messed up one last time here, not even capable of dying properly, just as I'm not even capable of speaking properly. But the last thing Saturn did was he screamed Emu's name in the presence of these insects. The Vice Admirals aren't even world nobles, who also probably don't know Emu's name either, but you've now given the secret name to 9 insects who are going to take it back to their hives. Also, here's another thing about Doberman. He's one of the Marines who practices absolute justice. So it's actually huge to have a representative of the most loyal faction speaking up and questioning the world government, because absolute justice believers aren't inherently evil people. They're willing to do evil things for the greater good, but only because they can see that light. And without that light, what do they have? Not a lot, if anything. But we're moving onwards now to Saint Saturn's replacement, and there's no way I could have predicted this. This is wild. But Vigilant Garling is the new warrior god of science and defense, and there is a lot happening here. Firstly, the way in which Garling casually strolls into the room of authority looks more intimidating than I think any of the other Elder Stars have ever looked, even in their transformed states. There's something about Garling that exudes serious business. And maybe it's just because I've watched the 5 Elders be bested by a cartoon, and for the rest of my days I will never be able to get pouty Marcus Mars out of my mind. But the 4 remaining elders all feel so powerless before Garling. They even try to check him. They're all like, "Oh, don't you go speaking to us in those weird ways, Garling." And Garling's just like, "Dude, you're not my bosses anymore." And Garling's presence makes the Elder Stars feel like a genuine threat to me again. And this was very needed after their complete failure on Egghead. And even though this still isn't technically canon, the Figaland name first appeared in One Piece film Red. It was mentioned by Ethan Barrett and Venus Juro, and he did so in quite an exasperated way. The same sort of way that Sengoku talks about Garp's family, implying that the Figalands are a different and troublesome family, which, given Shanks, fair enough, but I doubt that Garling is immune from this impression. So that's why there's an added layer of tension here. It's not just that Saturn has been killed and replaced, I guess that happens from time to time, but it's that he's been replaced by a Figaland. And despite Garling's immaculate service, the other 4 elders seem to inherently distrust him. So let's talk about the suit. I love it. It's very clean and imposing. And you can very much tell that Garling is from the same generation as Garp, because Prime Garp dressed very much the same way 20 to 30 years ago. Black suit, bright jacket, it was the style at the time. But I like the idea that this decision didn't take Garling by surprise. Because I don't know about you, but if I was called upon to become an Elder Star, I would have nothing appropriate to wear. So what I'm picturing is Garling having planned this moment for decades. So much so that he's had an Elder Star suit on hand, ready to don at a moment's notice. But here's a question. Who gave Garling this order? The obvious and I think only answer is Emu or Emu's servant, but that would imply that Garling knows about Emu, or at least knows enough to know that he outranks the elders. Although the most exciting part about this promotion to me is that Garling is almost certainly going to get his own yokai transformation. And there's a couple of yokai who have fun moon bases, and one of them is Katsura Otoko, a handsome man who lives in the face of the moon, which very much tracks with Garling's youth. He was quite the ladies' man, and who knows, he might still be. There's also a Jade Rabbit yokai who lives on/in the moon, but it could also have nothing to do with the moon. Although I doubt it, because this makes me feel so stupid in retrospect, and I'm sure that other people somewhere have called this, but Garling was so obviously set up to become an elder, because the moon is his motif. And so what we've now done is we've gotten rid of the planet Saturn, and we've replaced him in our One Piece solar system with the moon, which likely makes the other planets very jealous because the moon is closest to the Earth. The Earth in this case being what Emu represents. And one thing we should also consider is that Garling's promotion means that the Holy Knights now need a new commander. They've been set up to be a very major faction going forward, and I am more keen than ever to learn more about them. Right now, let's get into some Vega chat. In the previous chapter, I discussed what I really liked about what happened with Lilith, being that she was the last remaining Vegapunk, but seemingly incorporated the aspects of all of the other punks bar Greed, and thus became the next true Stella. But as it turns out, none of that is actually true. When Lilith said that everyone else was alive, she was being quite literal. And I guess for a second, I forgot that I was reading One Piece. Part of me is definitely happy that Atlas, Edison, Pythagoras, and Shaka do live on, and they're all now bodily roommates in this wild character design that Frankenstein's them all together. But as always with One Piece, I can't help but feel a bit robbed at another set of fake-out deaths. To be clear here, these deaths are different, because since the very beginning, one of the main themes of Egghead Island has been what constitutes constitutes death. Be it biological, be it clones or mechanical, and logically, this does make sense. If Vegapunk can separate those aspects from himself in the first place, then why can't their consciousness be uploaded to some other big brainy thing and live on? Because what even are they? They themselves don't even know. Shaka couldn't even comprehend what death meant for his existence. And I mean, that's practically the title of the chapter. Everything works. This isn't a Pell, Pagaya, or Pound situation where survival makes little to no sense, but I do still personally feel a bit robbed. Because with Shaka, Pythagoras, and Atlas, their death scenes were so good. Especially Atlas's, and I'm a bit tired of Oda milking these scenes with these emotions and not following through. Because every time it happens, it makes me care a lot less about the next character who's in danger and or given a death scene. Mark my words, something similar to this is going to happen with a character on Elbaph, and when I discuss the chapter that week, I'm going to feel nothing. Because in the back of my mind, I'm going to be thinking that it's not real, and that Oda is going to pull another fake out death. And if Oda had to do this, what I wish is that the Vegapunks combined into a new body, not just pieces of their old bodies, and that they could actually become a new satellite, Punk 7 or whatever. Because that would still give their sacrifices some weight, because we still would have lost those characters. At least those incarnations of them. I'll also say that I predict that upon rereading Egghead Island, I'll probably be a lot more generous about this, because it is both thematically and logically sound, but right now, it's just not for me. I mean, why do we even care about Lilith surviving now? If we didn't rescue her, she'd still be alive with all of her punk people anyway. And here's the thing, if this is the only time that this had happened in One Piece, I would probably be calling this fantastic. But because I've experienced over 1,100 chapters of fake out deaths, this situation, as well written as it is, just feels like another example to add to a very large pile. Every fake out death that has come before it has pulled me out of this and made me quite cynical about it. And the one thing I'm really hoping for right now is, of course, that Stella remains dead, which it looks like he is, and in defense of this decision, it is very nice that his will now lives on in its entirety, with the 6 aspects still able to influence the world around them, and hopefully work towards completing Vegapunk's dream. I did also laugh when Atlas suggested that they throw away all of the spare York bits. That was pretty funny. And after taking Punk Records high into the sky, they contacted someone that I did not expect to see. Their first point of call was Haradas on Witheria, which is where Nami spent 2 years during the time skip. And of course, Haradas knows Vegapunk. That's probably how Witheria was even made in the first place. It's not a natural sky island. It was one that was probably constructed with Vegapunk's cloud tech. So I wonder if these 2 islands are going to link up. And what I also really like is the idea of Punk Records not falling into the hands of the world government, or in fact anyone. Instead, it's floating up into the sky, and it's going to leave the world until humanity is capable of using it without destroying themselves, which Shaka estimates will be about 500 years, which is the length of time that Vegapunk was stated to be looking ahead into the future. There is something really nice and grand about that, and part of me hopes that by the end of One Piece, humanity still will not be ready to use Punk Records, and that Punk Records is a tale for another time in the distant future, that it represents a hope that one day humanity will become that utopian vision that Vegapunk desired, and that maybe along the way the next great generation will stumble upon it during their adventure. This also turns Punk Records into a new Phantom Island, which is very exciting. The only other Phantom Island we knew about before now is Zoe, and stuff like that just makes this world so much more magical. But not as magical as the most magical moment of all, right at the end of the chapter, which is that Dragon finally looks like he is strongly considering making a move for the first time since Logtown. And we are going to talk about all of this alongside the rest of the Revolutionary Army revelations in the next video. I felt what was missing in this chapter is Dragon announcing, let's go get the One Piece. Alright, so the problem with doing that is that it would imply that Dragon's going to actually do something. I did find his dialogue quite funny in this chapter because he's all like, oh, we must hurry or else world bad. And what he's doing and what he's been doing is exactly not that. He's just standing there looking east like always. And you know, some people may accuse him of looking west, but I bet that the camera's just flipped to the other side of his body. So you know what? Actually, let me show you guys something. I was recently gifted this Dragon keyring by the fun people at the Joy Girl channel. And the reason why I have him on my wall here is because this direction, this one here, is east. And it would genuinely bother me if my Dragon was facing any other direction. In regards to the One Piece itself, Dragon absolutely has to go after it now, right? After Vegapunk's message, it's very clear that whoever attains this treasure is going to be the one who earns the right to dictate the future of the planet. Bello Betty in this chapter even says that they can't allow, quote, that to happen. That being someone else being crowned the Pirate King and deciding the fate of the world. And one very surprisingly huge revelation that came from this section was that there are not one, but 4 colossal bridges under construction. For the last 700 years, it's not just Tequila Wolf, there's also Vodka Wolf, Rum Wolf, Bourbon Wolf, and let's also not forget San Juan Wolf, who when horizontal also becomes a colossal bridge. But having 4 bridges makes so much sense, because prior to this it had been assumed that Tequila Wolf was one singular massive world bridge, kind of like another red line, or at least intended to be because it's still far from finished. With Tequila Wolf being in East Blue, I imagine that Bourbon, Rum, and Vodka are its equivalent in the other 3 blues. The Vodka Wolf is a very interesting name though, because we already have a Vodka Kingdom as well, although that's in the Grand Line. The Vodka Kingdom is Kaido's island of origin, the one that tried to sell Kaido to the Marines for the right to attend the Reverie. And I know that vodka is a fairly basic word, but I am surprised that Oda would use it twice, because it does already refer to a prominent specific place in the One Piece world. And I mean, yeah, other drinks are available, gin, whiskey, brandy, but yeah, I guess it makes sense. The whole building of the massive bridges, knowing that the plan is to flood the world. My question is still, where are these bridges going though? After the world has been flooded, there's not really a lot of desire to leave the Red Line, I imagine, due to all of the not existence that happens outside of it. So I wonder if these bridges are leading to particularly high points in the 4 blues, and are important locations for cultivating resources. This might just be me overanalyzing a panel, but I think that this chapter reinforces the idea that Jupiter is a traitor. He was quite shocked and was sweating after finding out that Garling became an elder. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say traitor, but Jupiter is certainly shook by the situation. If you look at his close-up panel there is a very defined sweat drop. And part of this is probably what I mentioned in the chapter review video, which is that the Figurland family are quite an unpleasant wild card in World Noble Society, and up until now they've been tolerable because the other elders outranked them. However, now that Garling shares their authority, this introduces a very uncomfortable element. But also I think it's very possible that Jupiter is, for the first time potentially in centuries, coming to terms with his own mortality. In this moment, he knows that Saturn is either dead or dying. A thought I can't imagine has crossed the minds of the elders in, again, centuries. Each of them have become far too complacent with their effective immortality, and this is a harsh reminder that Imu can take that away whenever he sees fit. It's very difficult to see Jupiter being a traitor though, although he is the warrior god of agriculture, meaning that this current food shortage of Marajwa is very much under his jurisdiction. But if there was to be a traitor, then if anything, I would be suspicious of Figurland Garling, simply because he has the aura of a man with ambition. He didn't park himself into that seat in the Room of Authority with the intention of being comfortable for all eternity, so I could definitely see him aiming to be the sole ruler of the world, especially since he commanded the Holy Knights, as they're probably a lot more loyal to Garling than they would be to any elder, and perhaps even Imu, if they even know about Imu. Saturn didn't scream Imu's name. They were talking using that telepathy thing. Alright, so we're going to talk about this because I got a surprisingly huge amount of people actuallying me on the internet, specifically when I said that Saturn screamed Imu's name. But Saturn both says Imu via telepathy, he says Imu-sama, and then what happens if you read the rest of the bubbles on that page is that he screams Imu's name out loud. He does it in 2 parts because in Japanese, Imu is 2 characters, so Saturn goes Imu, and that's the last thing he says before he dies. And canonically, the last thing Saturn ate before he died was that ever so succulent sausage, quite the last meal. I think there will now be an edict that there never was a Saint Saturn. Figurland Garling was always warrior god of science. You see, that is an interesting thought, like Imu did with Lucia. He destroyed it and then boldly claimed, what do you mean destroyed? It never existed. Which works well enough because after comprehending that an entire island was wiped out, who exactly is going to be brave enough to claim that Lucia did in fact exist? And from there, all it takes is a single generation of denial, and the Lucia is effectively wiped away from history as the next generation don't ever learn about it, which is also very likely what happened with God Valley. The people of Sengoku's generation remember it, but they dare not speak it, and no one in the next generation under him has even heard of the island before. So yeah, I could definitely see a similar thing happening with Saint Saturn. Everyone pretends that he never existed. It was Garling all along. All hail the sciencing science man. This is a question that probably needs to be asked. What does Garling even know about science, if anything? I feel like Garling's skill set is more suited to Topman Warcury's job as the warrior god of justice. But then again, who even cares about the science part? I think that Garling definitely has the warrior god part covered, which should be more than enough. But something that this chapter has made me very curious about is how public the 5 elders have been throughout history, because we've confirmed that Saint Saturn is at least over 200 years old, and surely over time someone's looked at that and gone, hang on a second. I suppose most people in the One Piece world never see the faces of the 5 elders. It's really just the world nobles and the fleet admirals. And while other world nobles do see their faces, they're probably too concerned with their own selfish pursuits to really care. So a perpetually youthful individual could, in plain sight, easily slip past the notice of the world. Imagine Katarina Devon walking into Marijois with Saturn's appearance thinking he was alive. So one of my artists showed me the perfect gif for the situation. We have Katarina Devon rocking up to Marijois, ready to infiltrate the 5 Elder Stars, and the other 4 just stare at her like the Batman animated series villains. A lot of people are wondering what the point of Katarina having Saturn's powers is now, and I imagine that there's a couple of ways this can go. One is that Saint Saturn's death isn't reported, in which case Devon could still use her power quite effectively on those who don't know. But another handy feature is that it could allow Katarina Devon to control the Seraphim, using the form of an Elder Star who has that highest command authority. It is difficult to see what else she could do with it if Saturn's death is announced, but because Oda made it happen, it's definitely going to be important. What I do know is that if Saturn is publicly declared dead, then the person who is going to be taking 100p of that blame is our Monkey D. Luffy. Even the Vice Admirals aren't quite sure what happened to Saturn. They thought it was some sort of external condition or disease. And apart from screaming the name Emu, there's nothing really pointing to this being the work of the world government. So Luffy could actually have the death of an Elder Star pinned on him because there's no better option, and Morgans would gladly run with that story to keep Luffy's global villain arc in full swing. Now that Kaku's felt the same pain that Paulie felt, he could realize the justice he's fought for isn't the true justice. That's right, from the moment it happened, I've always loved this. Stussy betraying Kaku is exactly what Kaku did to Paulie. And I bet that's a huge part of why Kaku felt so sentimental about her, because he could actually empathize with her situation. After Zoro beat Kaku at Enies Lobby, Kaku said that he genuinely enjoyed his time as a shipwright and no doubt made real friends at Galilea before he went and betrayed them. And I wonder if Rob Lucci feels the same, but to a lesser degree. I mean, they spent 5 years on Water 7. If anything, they built deeper bonds with the Carpenters of Galilea than Stussy did with them, considering that she only knew them for what, like 2 years at most? I don't know where this puts Kaku on the justice spectrum though, because he both betrayed and was betrayed for the sake of justice. There's no clear indicator of what is right. I guess more betrayal. Betrayal is always justice. And I'm also not sure if Kaku's views on justice have ever been made clear, unlike Rob Lucci, who pre-time skip practiced what he referred to as dark justice, which is like absolute justice, except instead of believing that the ends justify the means, a practitioner of dark justice deliberately seeks out means that could result in the ends, basically using justice as an excuse to do horrible things. Although I think that Rob Lucci's justice has changed to excessive justice during the CP9 cover story. If you look closely, Edison's speech bubble is different from the other 3 sharing that body. It does. Edison has a regular speech bubble, whereas the other punks have double-lined bubbles with the lightning bolt things. And this is why I kept Edison out of the fake death discussion in the previous video, because it seems pretty clear that Edison also survived. He wasn't given a death scene, and that now Atlas, Pythagoras, and Shaka are also inhabiting Edison's body. And Edison's being a very good sport about this whole situation by adding their pieces to him so that they can all feel a bit more comfortable in their new Frankenpunk state. And this was also pointed out to me by many people in the comments, but Punk Records is now quite literal cloud storage. And I can't help but think that this was intentional by Oda. His imagination works in very literal ways. So I'm thinking that he heard the term one day, and his first thought was, well, what would cloud storage look like? And that might be part of what contributed to our new Phantom Island. I've been wondering if maybe the remaining Vegapunks in Witheria will be the next cover story after Yamato's. I think that would be a really fun idea. I would love to follow the Vegapunks floating around the planet and discovering more of Sky Society, or maybe even running into some of the aliens from space that we know are definitely out there. But there's quite a few good subjects for our next cover story. I think that Sentomaru is still a strong candidate. Seeing him sadly sail away on his teeny tiny boat is a story that is begging to be continued in some form. Stussy is also a very high possibility, but my eyes are also on the Egghead Island Vice Admirals. It's so rare that we get marine-focused cover stories. In fact, the only one I can think of was Kobe's. CP9 had one as well, but they're not Marines. And what I'd be really keen to see is a structure, sort of like the Straw Hat Grand Fleet cover story, where we saw a couple of pages of each member, but with the 9 Egghead Vice Admirals, each reckoning with their experiences and choosing their own paths forward. I don't think it's likely to happen, but then again, most cover stories have been dedicated to former arc villains. And with Saint Saturn dead, then that would kind of be these guys. Or Kizaru, maybe a Kizaru cover story. Either way, it's not something that we're anywhere near close to, because Yamato's story is still probably about 20 installments away from finishing at the very least, if we go by past cover story numbers. The Germa cover story was 33 pages, Capone Gang Beige's cover story was 37 pages, and right now Yamato is still at 13, so we're probably not even halfway through yet. Speaking of, Yamato is now in Kuri, where Odin Castle is being reconstructed. However, the head carpenter Minatomo is missing. So this guy, there is a weirdly rich history behind this character that goes all the way back to chapter 1. In chapter 1, Higuma the bear enters the bar by kicking down the door. However, when Higuma leaves the bar, this door is now magically intact. quite the continuity error, or is it? I mean, yes it is. But every time there's a continuity error or something strange happens in One Piece, Oda then invents something stupid for it to make sense. In this case, when the error was pointed out to him, Oda said, no. The door was fixed due to the work of a carpenter named Minatomo-sama. He has a short temper, so he cannot pass by a broken door or what have you without repairing it. I assure you, this wasn't my mistake. And in the anime, Minatomo also became an Easter egg character like Panda Man. He pops up a lot during early One Piece. But in the manga, we didn't see him again, or actually at all, until chapter 909 on Wano as Frankie's carpenter boss, except this is not him. It is an identical relative also named Minatomo. And that identical relative is the guy that's now currently missing, who I imagine that Yamato will now need to save from whatever minor problem is happening. Maybe someone kidnapped him like the woman who was almost kidnapped last time. And shortly, we should also be finding out who the new daimyo of Kuri is, because there's not a whole lot of point in rebuilding a castle that no one lives in. Punk 7 is Kid. So this is referring to what I said in the last video, that I would have liked the Vegapunks to come together in a completely new incarnation, rather than cobbling bits together, which I then labeled as Punk 7. And this commenter is correct. Punk 7 does already exist, apparently. Long ago there was, and I suppose still is, a theory that Eustace Kid was a Vegapunk satellite. And for this theory to work, what you need to do is forget that Kid already has an entire backstory. But once you've successfully done that, what we do is we take a look at this damned punk attack, and we can clearly see that marked on the cobbled together weapon is 07, in the same way that all of the actual Vegapunk satellites are marked with their respective numbers, which is definitely interesting. The combination of the 7 with an attack partially named Punk. And hey, what I will say for this is that even though it has almost no chance of being true, it would explain why Kid keeps trying to relentlessly ram his head against emperors, because being a satellite would make him a significantly more one-dimensional character. And if Atlas wasn't the aspect of violence, then Kid could be, and it would explain why he's incapable of thinking about anything except solving his problems with violence, or more accurately, creating his own problems to solve with violence via violence. That's how desperate we are as a fan base to rationalize Kid's actions and give him a sense of relevancy. Unfortunately, I think he's just not quite there in the mind brain. Dibs on the spare York parts. Mate, as if you would even know what to do with those parts. York is massive. You trying to do anything to her would just be throwing a sausage down a hallway. I find it funny that York is going to Marijois when there's a food shortage. I'm sure she will love that. Yeah, even if the elders do make good on their promise, it's a really bad time to become a world noble. We got another glimpse of their ongoing food issues because, to their credit, the Revolutionary Army did an incredible amount of damage during the Reverie, and it is seriously taking a toll on world noble society. At the moment, our problem is that the world nobles can't eat exactly what they want whenever they want it. In this chapter, a poor chef even got shot because he served fish instead of beef. Rare world noble dub, because I'm not a big fish fan. But if this keeps up, the problem is going to very rapidly become that they just cannot eat full stop. And someone's going to end up being their target. They need to figure out a person to blame, and that might end up being Sakazuki. He's the one responsible for their protection, and their campaign against him might be what prompts Sakazuki to say F it and go off on his own justice crusade. This feels like it's definitely the beginning of their undoing though. Because while everyone else in the world is focused on finding the One Piece, the world nobles are focused on their snacks. And that brings us back to York. Once she gets to Marijois and realizes that she can't eat anything she wants, anytime she wants, in fact, her food will be significantly more ration than it was on Egghead Island, then what does the aspect of greed do from there? Probably join whoever promises to feed her the most, and no one has more credentials in this area than the rotund physique of Blackbeard.